Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LPL Week number 5 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. Very excited to get back to some LPL coverage. We still have a lot of games to cover basically every single week from this point onwards, and I'm excited to get into it, but a little bit of housekeeping, at least at the beginning here. If you've probably already noticed, we're only 20 seconds in, but my voice is almost entirely gone. I will be doing this LPL video a little bit more subdued, a little bit more reserved. Just threw out my voice at a wrestling event yesterday, and now I'm here having to record this LPL video. So if you notice the voice being a little different, or if you hear me voice crack or anything like that, I do apologize. There's only so much I can do about that without, getting this video out late. And so I am going to still be recording it, but it's going to be a little bit more subdued, a little bit quieter perhaps than the normal video. And hope you guys are okay with that. But of course, today we are going to be going over every single day, every single series of action in the LPL in week number 5. We're getting closer and closer to the back half of this split, really getting a good idea of the teams that are emerging at the right time and maybe emerging at the wrong time. But if you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. What teams are you excited about? What teams are you not excited about? There certainly was one team that certainly shocked and awed a lot of people over the course of week number 5, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people talking about that in the comments, but would love to know your thoughts on everything going on in the LPL. Of course, if you want to know mine, you can check out the iCard up in the corner right now, which is the LPL playlist. Every single week, every single thing that's happened in the LPL in that playlist. You can check that out if you want to know my opinions on everything that's happened up until this point. But without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team is able to generate. I'll be giving my player of the series and my dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I'll be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, I will also be updating my power rankings. After 5 weeks of action, we're really getting a much better idea of the teams that are over and underperforming individually, and so I'm excited to go over that. But without further ado, we've got so much to cover in today's video. Let's jump right into day number 1, and we kick day 1 off with truly one of the more interesting series that we could have gotten on the first day. It was Top Esports taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and FPX is picking up a massive victory in this one. TES has felt very strong at the start of this split. They've only lost 2 games the entirety of this split, both of them to Bilibili Gaming in their only series loss. They've been undefeated outside of that, which has been genuinely outstanding. They have really lived up to expectations, but FPX is really surging at the current moment, and it's all off the back of their superstar rookie jungler, Milky Way, right now, who is just playing at a ridiculously high level. This was a very close series, and honestly, FPX probably shouldn't have walked out of it with the win. Top Esports had the win in game number 3, but bad macro, giving over objectives, specifically Dragon Soul, for free. It just kind of led to them losing a lot of the pressure they were able to generate in the early game in FPX with a really nice comeback, but you got to give a lot of that credit to Milky Way, who just continues to be a hyper carry. I mean, no matter what champions he has been on, he has actually been able to completely take over and change every game that he has been in, whether it's been on the marksman, that, the Graves, the Kindred in particular, Viego or Xin Zhao in this series, specifically the Xin Zhao. It was amazing stuff from him, and he's really emerging as one of the better junglers in the LPL. We've hyped him up all split long, but it's just continued. He was going into Tion and Top Esports in this series, and he still was able to dominate and carry a lot of games, specifically that second game where FPX really did just outplay Top Esports. It was really impressive stuff. Milky Way is very quickly making his way up into like the top, 5 or 6 junglers in the LPL, which is crazy to say. It's a very crowded room right there, but in terms of the performance that he's put out this year, he's already made his way up into like one of the best junglers in the entire league so far in 2024. I think FPX has also really started to unlock kind of their secondary supportive players, their more facilitative oriented players, specifically Life in the support position, who feels like he has really come back around to like Genji Life rather than Hanwha Life Esports last year. He's been really good, like very quietly, very good. I know a lot of people are criticizing this bot lane and Dectum in particular, and his positioning isn't perfect. I don't love TF bot. I think it's generally been a lot more successful in the solo lane, specifically top lane, but Life, I think, has been very good on these engagers, creating a lot of opportunities for FPX. He is not afraid to go and try and make a play, and oftentimes this team is in a pretty good position to be able to follow up on that. So credit to Life. I thought he's been very good. Care, I think, has really gotten better. He was a little bit weaker, I would say, at the start of the split, but he's kind of settled into this more supportive role, has been a carry on this team for the last couple of years because they've lacked a lot of carry talent around him. But with Milky Way, with Dectum, I think there's a big opportunity for Care to play the Karma or the TF a bit more and actually be able to do a whole ton on it. And this was one of his more complete series, I would say. Unfortunately for FPX, they're going to get the rare distinction of dud of the series being on their team. Xiao Lao, who in the top lane was not very good. He almost solo lost game number 3 on the Fiora because of just how poor he was in the individual top lane matchup. Credit to 369, he's very good at the game. But Xiao Lao, who is not a great top laner. He kind of broke out a bit last year, got a little bit more consistent, had a couple of really solid games, probably had the best split of his entire career, but at the end of the day, this guy's proven over and over again that he's a below average top laner, and for a team like FPX that now, especially with this win, is very much like we have playoffs at minimum in our sights and in our expectations. I don't know if Xiao Lao, who's the kind of top laner that can survive that. He was really bad in game number 3, but Milky Way has been so good. Life has been so good. I really trust Dectum, even if he hasn't been perfect, and, Care is really starting to find his role. I think there's enough firepower on FPX to really take one of those top 10 spots for sure, especially after a win like this. And if Milky Way continues to grow and evolve and become like an MVP player for FPX, the sky's the limit for what this organization can do this year. And then for TES on the other side, it sucks that this is your first loss to like a non-top 2 team and to non-BLG, but you probably should have won this series, and that's at least some level of takeaway. Jackie Love was awesome in game number 1 on the Senna. That's definitely something I want to point out, but the rest of the team really just kind of lost its focus, I think, as this series went on. I'm not going to worry about it too much when you're looking at the mechanical plays of this team. They were the better team in this series, which definitely gives you some encouragement that, if you play this series, 5 times, that they win this 4 out of 5 times, and this is just the one that they threw away, especially if they start to focus a bit more as we get closer to playoffs or in playoffs in bigger series. I'm not going to freak out too much, but you would have liked to see some, more cohesive game-ending kind of plays coming in from Top Esports that you just didn't get here. Like I said, Jackie Love was good. Mako was good in game 1, but he was really bad in game number 2 on the Ashe, like almost game-losing bad. Milky Way really took advantage of that Ashe, and Mako really has not been phenomenal on that champ. But when you talk about Tion, you just hope that he was going to have a little bit more pressure, but Milky Way was the better jungler in this series, and that was a bit of a problem. Cream and 369 were pretty good. They're definitely the two that I looked at and said, yeah, you played pretty well. Jackie Love probably could have been a bit more down the stretch of this series, but like I said, I'm not freaking out too much about this Top Esports loss. I think if they continue to make this a trend, if their macro continues to be a problem, that's when I start to get concerned. But one series against a team that is kind of surging right now, where you kind of had it in the bag and then threw it away in game number 3, it's not something I'm going to worry about too much. I'm going to assume that this team's going to be able to bounce back later in the week. And then for FPX, this is obviously a huge win, and this very much cements the rise that they've kind of been on, especially because of Milky Way, but I'm not going to sit here and say they're a top 4 team in the league because of this win. I need to see a little bit more from this team. They're going to have opportunities over the second half of this week where they basically only play upper tier teams or teams with expectations. If they can walk out of this week with a pretty good record, that's going to be very telling, but this is just about as good of a way to start week 5 as you could ask for them. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1 here, and it's the continuation of a hot streak for a pretty good team here. It's Invictus Gaming taking on LGD Gaming, and Invictus is going to continue the good run of form that they are currently on, moving to 6-2. This is a nice 2-1 series win. It's a pretty typical LGD series where they're able to take game number 1. They look pretty solid. They're able to play around whoever on the team ends up being strong. Shockingly enough, it's Xiaoya in this one. It finally feels like this team is starting to find some consistency at the AD carry position with Xiaoya actually getting some full-time starts here. He was really good in their final series of the previous week, if I remember correctly, and it's really nice to see that development, but Invictus Gaming is just a better team here, and they were able to show that over the second half. Leon, I think, has really integrated himself well into this roster, and I think they really have the potential to be a top 5-ish team in the LPL, especially with how open everything is at that stage right now. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to On. I think you could give this to Wink as well. Either of them kind of deserve this. They both were able to take over this series in a pretty, strong way. The bot lane was definitely the focus for IG, which I think is very encouraging because they really haven't been over the course of this year. On in particular, I think has not necessarily been that star that he was in spring of last year. Definitely took a bit of a step back in summer of 2023. It's nice to see him have a series like this where they can put a lot of resources into things like Tristana and Draven and these early game carries, and he can put that back out and be a positive for Invictus overall. But, Wink has been phenomenal, I think, across this entire year. We've talked a lot about Cryon kind of being the central focus for how IG wants to play the game, really wanting to play around mid lane and, enable him in team fights, and that's great. But, Leon's a very aggressive jungler who wants to play a bit more early game, and so when you have a support that's going to be willing to roam and be super active on the map and look to make plays, be aggressive like Wink is, I think that's really beneficial to the team overall. And so for On and Wink to kind of get back, I'm not going to say entirely to what they were in spring, of last year because they were definitely the focal point of this team in spring, and they're just not that anymore for this roster, but you know, they still have the talent. They're still an upper half bot lane, and I think that's all you really need to be on this IG team to make them competitive. Leon continues to be awesome. His addition to this team has honestly really reinvigorated them. You know, I was very, low on Tianjin. I think generally over the course of his LPL tenure, never really felt like he was a consistently good jungler. He would take a lot of risks, flip the game on 50-50s. Even if he wasn't doing that as much this year, it kind of took away a lot of the good plays that he was making last year as well. And so for someone like Leon, who's just better than Tianjin, a better version of Tianjin at the current moment, I think it helps out a lot. Leon is going to flip games. He is going to take more aggressive engages, but for the most part, he's just more talented and more consistent in his current state, and a lot of that has worked out. He was obviously fantastic in his debut week, in week number 4, and he continued to be really good in this series. You Should Know Me, I think, has taken that next step. Like him a lot on tanks right now, which is something we were not saying last year, and Cryham, considering he's been the focal point of this team, to see 3 games where he's more of a facilitator, especially in the back half of the series on Talia and on Karma, it's really good to show that IG has multiple styles that they can go to. I think generally this just was a nice series for Invictus. Continues on their hot streak, and something that they don't do a lot of is beat bad teams. They beat the good teams, lose to the bad teams. They're kind of that team in the LPL. Nice to see them actually get the job done against an LGD team that has kind of punched above their weight so far this year and didn't really look horrendous in this series. Again, Xiaoya actually looked pretty good, especially in game number 1 on the Xayah, but LGD did their standard thing of win game 1, lose games 2 and 3. Like, that's kind of what they have been all year long, and they continued that here. I think if Jin Zhao had been slightly more aggressive, or maybe at times slightly less aggressive, or maybe just made better plays, I think LGD could have made some of these fights a little bit closer, especially in game number 2, but that's just not how it ended up working out. He's going to get done of the series here, just consistently going in without a lot of backup, or alternatively not making enough plays on the Alistair in game number 3 to really separate them. I think generally he has been okay for this team this split, and he's kind of just had a very Jin Zhao split. He's been the same exact thing since he joined LGD as their starting support. He's been a guy who's going to have 1 or 2 good games every so often, but is generally going to be a below average or bottom half, whatever you want to say, support in the LPL. That's just kind of what he was in this series. Hai Chao has kind of been the carry for this team for most of this year, but I don't really think he did a whole ton in this series. Maybe you aren't super mad about the way he played Hui at the end of this, but I don't really think he was all that impactful. Meteor was quietly very bad, especially in game number 2. Tried his best to get some resets in game number 3 on the Viego, where he did look a little better, but I really did not like the way that he played the second game of this series. I thought he almost solo lost it for LGD. He's not been as good as he was last year, in my opinion, for this team. And Bertle, he's fine on the top side. He's going to be a little bit more aggro in terms of the lane matchups, but he's not nearly as bad as people on Reddit would like to make him out to be. LGD is just one of those teams. I mean, they're sitting around number 12, number 13, number 14. They would be lower if teams around them actually had showed any semblance of consistency, but that's just not happened in the bottom half of the LPL right now. And so LGD, considering they actually have players that are performing relatively okay, they sit in a relatively okay spot in the power rankings, but Invictus is a playoff team. They are a team that should be beating a team like LGD, and that's exactly what they did here. On and Wink looked really good. I'm really liking the way Leon is playing, and Crying and You Should Know Me were the stars at the beginning of the split for this team, and so IG continuing to kind of click in a way that you're excited to see. And now moving on to day number 2 here in week number 5, and we kick day 2 off with a battle of blue teams. Bilibili Gaming taking on Thunder Talk Gaming, and predictably BLG is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. Would have been pretty not good if anything else happened here. There were moments where things were interesting in game number 2. UCal was able to get a bit of gold and, at least try to make things interesting on the Azir, but he was so horrendous in game number 1. Thunder Talk is just not working. Like, this team is worse than they were last year, and that's a very sad thing to say. When you carry over most of the players from last year, you're seeing kind of the continuity advantage that a team like Invictus has at the beginning of the year, and then kind of the opposite for Thunder Talk, where these players are just not playing well in their current state. And a team like Bilibili is just way too good to ever fall to something like that. They're very, very, very dangerous. And generally at the end of game 2, maybe it would have been more interesting if you didn't have a 50,000 damage Cassante on the enemy team that just kind of ran over you in a team fight, but that was the reality of the situation. Player of the series is going to go to Bin in the top lane. Maybe the best series that he has played so far this year. I've actually been kind of critical of Bin because it feels like everybody else on this team has stepped up and been really important in very important situations. For Bilibili, June and Knight have been the 2 best players on this team. On has been very consistent, and Elk had a great series against JD Gaming that really pushed them over the top there. It's been Bin that you've really been waiting to see break out. You're not really concerned because Bin is a little bit notorious for maybe taking regular seasons a little less seriously. That's kind of been the MO of Bin for most of his career. But it's good to see him have a series like this where he goes up against the worst top laner in the league, or one of the worst top laners in the league at the very least in Hoya, and just destroys him, just kind of dominates team fights, is able to win games on his own, be that really game-breaking team fighter that he is kind of known for. That's the MO of Bin. He's a great laner, but he's the best team fighting top laner in the world, and that's, what makes him arguably the best top laner in the world. Him and Zeus, whatever you want to say, right? They're both very, very good. It's nice to see K'Sante continue to dominate, because that champion is ridiculously broken, and as long as he continues to exist in the state that he's in, he's going to be a full tank that can deal 50,000 damage in one game, and that's just, it is what it is. But it wasn't just Bin. June was amazing in this series. The Jax game in game one, Jax jungle's not something we've seen be super effective at the pro level. It's been very hit or miss, and oftentimes it's miss, and it really takes a good jungler who's better than his opponent to make Jax work, because he takes some time to get really rolling. But this is a team comp that's really there to enable that Jax jungle, and I think it worked in game one, and the Vi was a great facilitator in game two. June is really good at that champion. Knight, Elk, On, they were all really good, but I think it was the top side of the map that really impressed me. Bin, obviously the main carry of game two, whether you want to notch that up to him or his champion, that's really up to you. And then I think June was also incredibly impressive. He's been an MVP guy over the beginning part of this split. Bilibili should be winning a series like this. This isn't a shock. But for Thunder Talk on the other side of this, they're not very good right now, and I think I talked about how disappointing that was last week, and nothing's really changed. Yucal was kind of the one that was pushing them forward. I called him, stuck on this team, because I thought he was a lot better than this team could ever really reproduce around him, and, that's just kind of, it is what it is, and he definitely still shows signs of that, like the Azir in game number 2, where he almost single-handedly was able to win that game, but it's not like he was good in game number 1 on the Ori when this team got absolutely blasted. I get it's against Knight, who's the best mid laner in the region, but, the rest of this team is not good. The top side of this map is maybe the worst in the entire region. Beishwan is going to get done of the series again, by far the most of those of anybody in the LPL so far in 2024. I was a Beishwan defender last year. I thought his macro was incredibly good, and he was a big reason why this team was consistently outpacing a lot of other teams. And, Yucal was getting a lot of free advantages because Beishwan's tempo was very good, even if his mechanics were a little bit lackluster. It's just not matched in 2024. It's not there anymore. This guy has been a huge negative for Thunder Talk, and it continues to show. Hoya might be the single worst top laner in the LPL. There were moments on the Zac in game 2 where it's like, okay, where you're looking okay, but if you look awful on Zac top in 2024, like in the state that he's currently in, that's a really bad sign. Hoya just can't beat anybody. 1xN, I think, has taken a major step back from what he was last year. You can talk about the team around him being worse, but his individual laning has been horrid, like, over the course of this split. One of the worst AD carries in the league so far. You would hope that he would have gotten better, but he really has stagnated and gotten worse since that, insertion last year into the starting lineup. Whereas Huanfeng, he might be able to save this team. And then Chocho tried his best to, do something, especially on the Heimer in game 2, but he also died 6,000 times. And so, really, what are you looking at for Thunder Talk? This is a bottom 3 to 4 team in the LPL, and that's so disappointing, because you talk about other teams with continuity being able to make things happen and make things work so far in 2024. Thunder Talk has just not been able to do that. This is not a good team, and they're not going to be a good team with this iteration of 5. I think you've got to replace top and jungle, whether that's mid-split or whether that's, after spring. You've got to go in a different direction, because this team is, they have too much talent. Yucal can be a playoff caliber mid laner, an upper caliber mid laner, and, you're wasting that prime opportunity right now with a lot of subpar players around him. I would expect changes at some point this year. And then for Bilibili, this is one of the best teams in the league. They're still at number 1 in my power rankings. This was not a difficult series for them. They looked amazing, and they're going to continue to look amazing. They should not have struggled in this series, and luckily for them, they didn't. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and moving from one top team to the other, it was JD Gaming taking on Team WE. And JD Gaming is going to pick up the 2-1 series win, and honestly, I really like this series from both teams, which is crazy to say. I think that there were positives to take away for WE, some things that are just okay, you got to live with that, and some things that you are concerned about, one position in general that I think you're a bit concerned about, but it's JD Gaming. You're not super worried about losing to this jungle mid of Kanavi and Yagao, who at one point in time 2 years ago were the most synergistic mid-jungle duo in the entire world, to drop a game to them or a couple of games to them where they were just really, really good. It's not horrible. It's still a fine series for you overall, and I'll explain why I'm still pretty high on WE and why I think it is pretty justified to have them in the top 5 of my power rankings. But let's start with JD Gaming, starting with player of the series, and that is going to be Yagao for me. I think a lot of people are going to give it to Kanavi because of the scoreline. The scoreline's just better. He had 7 more kills than Yagao, and basically everything else was the same. But Yagao's effect on the map, I think, was so massive in this series to be able to generate pressure. Obviously, the game 1, I don't think a lot of people are going to argue that he was amazing amazing in game 1 on the Karma, but it really was the Talia game in game 3 that separated him for me. He's so good at this champion. This is what I would consider to maybe be his signature champion at this point. He's just so active on the map. He's always in the right spot. He knows exactly how to space himself so that he's never in real danger against something like an Azir. It's really impressive stuff. He really plays this champion at its absolute maximum. And it makes it very difficult to see a way to actually deal with him. And it opens up, opportunities for Kanavi to play a lot more aggressive on something like the Xin Zhao, to dive in on something like the Xin Zhao. It's really nice to see. And honestly, without Yagao, I don't think they win this series nearly as comfortably. I still think they win because they're very good, but, he was amazing. And Kanavi was also amazing. He did benefit a lot from Yagao having so much prio and pressure in the mid lane, being the better mid laner in this series, but Kanavi still had to be the one to fight a lot of these fights, and boy did he, on the Jax, on the Xin Zhao, specifically on the Xin in game number 3, where he was just everywhere on the map doing so much, and he was by far the better jungler in this series. We'll get to WE. If they have a weakness, it's jungle right now, and Kanavi was definitely there to take advantage of it. Good stuff. Ruler and Missing were definitely more accessories in this series, but talk about good accessories. Once again, TF bot loses. It's something that is consistently lost in every single region. I'm going to keep pointing this out because he's winning very consistently in the top lane and in the mid lane. It's been very, very strong in both of those roles, but bot lane, it just seems to not work at the pro level. Certainly something I'm going to keep an eye on, but Ruler and Missing were fine. If you have a negative this series for JDG, it's Flandre getting camped in the top lane. He got so much pressure put his way from WE, and for the most part, he just didn't handle it very well. He's a very aggressive player that is going to push forward. This was his weakness on EDG back in the day as well, is that if you put a lot of resources into trying to shut him down, he's not exactly the player that's going to respect that and start to play a little bit slower, be weak side. It's never really been his thing. He's going to try and pressure the enemy top laner, especially in these like Aatrox versus Jax matchups that are going to be a little bit more confrontational just generally, and he did get taken advantage of it. Wayward was amazing in this series and continues to be an MVP favorite for a lot of people, and Flandre was the worst top laner of the two, but it wasn't bad enough to stop anything that happened jungle mid. They were able to get so much prio in the middle of the map to translate to the rest, and Flandre was still useful in the back half of these games. It just wasn't a perfect series. Overall, JDG looking good and WE looking fine. There were a couple of negatives, most specifically, again, jungle mid for them, which didn't end up working out, but Fofo has been really good this split. He has been a major positive for them on their 5-2 run before this series, and so yeah, he got outplayed by Yagao and was definitely the worst mid in this series, but he really hasn't been a huge problem for this team before, and Yagao's a very good player. I would expect Fofo to be able to bounce back and still be better than, most of the mid laners in the LPL, but if you are looking for a reason to be concerned, Hang in the jungle is that. He has been really bad for WE this split, definitely the worst player on this team. We talked about rookies that were really good last year that have just not been able to follow up those performances. Hang is kind of the epitome of that right now, where he has just not been nearly as good as he was last year. A lot of the development that we saw with him obviously coming in as this early game jungler who would just do nothing if he didn't have an advantage. He really kind of grew into a facilitator as the year went on. It's just not carried over into 2024. In fact, I think he's worse than he was at the beginning of 2023 right now. It's certainly a concern, but Wayward is amazing. You give him resources and he is going to absolutely dominate. Really glad to see somebody who I defended a ton over the course of the offseason and for the last 2 years on this channel actually get to prove that that was correct. And honestly, Stay has been terrific for this team. I really like Prince and I feel bad for him because I don't think he was justifiably benched, but Stay has significantly better chemistry with the rest of this roster, specifically Awandi in lane, where Prince and Awandi very much felt like they were never on the same page. Stay and Awandi very much feel like they are on the same page, and Stay is a very good player. He has earned his spot here in the LPL. I just feel bad for Prince because he's definitely an LPL caliber 80 carry as well, but WE is a good team. They just weren't good enough to get over JDG. It's not the worst thing in the world, but jungle simply has to be better for them to be a team that competes for top 4, which I do think is the upside with how Wayward and especially Stay coming in are playing right now. If Fofo can get back to the form that he was at, at the start of the last couple of weeks, like this could be a top 4 team. I know that's crazy to say, but the LPL really isn't all that locked in or strong at that stage right now. This is not a horrible WE team. When you have an MVP caliber player on the top side of the map, you're going to be in that conversation. And then for JDG, they're awesome. Them and Bilibili are the top 2 teams for a reason. JDG's only loss is to Bilibili. They're going to make series interesting in the regular season because that's just kind of what this org does. They rarely win 2-0, but they're going to, calmly and cleanly, I would say, end most of the series that they end up playing. Kanavi and Yagao are very good, and even if Flandre was a little bit more suspect on the top side of the map here, I still think JDG is, one of the best teams in the entire world. And then moving on now to day number 3 of week number 5, and we kicked it off with the battle of bottom teams. Sometimes fun, but sometimes not so much, like in this one. Ultra Prime taking on Rare Atom, and Ultra Prime is going to pick up the win here, a 2-0 win, even though it didn't necessarily look like that was going to be the case at the beginning of this series. They are going to be able to take the 2-0 win. Rare Atom is not a good team, despite what their 2 wins will show you last week. Did they prove that they weren't the worst team in the LPL? Probably. Like, EDG looks like the worst team in the LPL, and we'll see if that continues, but, you know, Ultra Prime still was above them in my power rankings. They look significantly more consistent in a lot of their games, and they were able to show that by being able to come back in game number 2 and being able to dominate game number 1 and looking a lot better as the team in this series. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. You know, these are both 2 of the worst teams in the league, and they showed that in this series. A lot of throws from both sides. Neither team necessarily wanted to win that second game. Player of the series for me is going to go to Uakai, but even then, like, Uakai made the game-winning plays in game number 2. Like, they don't win this series without Uakai, but he also tried his best to throw this series in game number 2, with one in particular really miserable play on Azir where he just, like, almost threw the game away by himself. You know, Uakai's a very aggressive player. We've talked about it. Definitely more of that melee assassin mentality type. Think Zeka, think Cream, like that kind of archetype of player. Uakai definitely fits into that. He's still good at a lot of these other champions, as we saw, but he's going to play them aggressively, and sometimes he's going to put himself in bad positions to do so. And so while he was the one that was generating a lot of the advantages for Ultra Prime in this series, he also was the one that was kind of getting destroyed for it in a lot of these games. And so you take the good with the bad, but against a team like RA, it's going to end up working out. I thought Hacker was pretty good in this series. He's honestly been better than I expected on Ultra Prime. Not that he was horrid on any of his other stops. This is always a player that I've, I guess, defended in a sense of like, yeah, I guess he's like an LPL caliber jungler. Just he's going to be a bottom half one every split. He's not going to be the worst, but he's going to be somewhere between like 12 and 15 in terms of LPL junglers every single split. Never going to get obliterated every single game. He's going to have good games, especially against bad junglers, but he's really not elite at anything. He's just kind of meh at everything. He'll have good series like he did here. I thought the Maokai game in game 1 was really good. Set up a lot of options for Ultra Prime. Doggo and Jue were fine. Definitely the better bot lane of the 2 in this series, because Asum and Zora are just not good. Like, they're really, really bad for Ultra Prime, or for Rare Atom, I should say, on the other side. But Doggo and Jue were fine. It's good to see them at least have an okay series when they really have not been good this year so far. And then, unfortunately, once again, we get that rare case. Dud of the series is going to stay on the winning side. It's going to go to Decade, who was awful in game number 2 on the Malphite. Like, I get it, sometimes those Malphite engages are going to be good, sometimes they're going to be bad, you got to take the good with the bad, but he's just not an LPL caliber top laner. I get it that he dominated the LDL and that other people were a lot more excited for him than I was, but this is a guy who's just been almost nothing at this level for his entire tenure, whether on LGD or here on Ultra Prime. He is not an LPL caliber top laner. You know, we talked about Hoya being the worst top laner in the LPL. I think Decade actually has a much better case to have that than Hoya does. Wasn't bad enough to lose them the game, but he was not very good. This guy's just not a good laner or a good team fighter in any aspect of the game. But again, Ultra Prime does not really become a good team from this win. This isn't changing my mind about how this team is or how they play. This is not a particularly good roster or team. They just did enough to be able to get over Rare Atom in this one, who is one of the worst teams in the LPL, and they've proven that basically all year long. They have no consistency, no synergy on this team, and it really hurts them. Their team fighting is awful. Maybe you can point out that Xiaoxu was the better top laner in this series, but it's not like he was dominant. He was just good enough on the Jax in game number 2 to make things useful, and then they threw away a gigantic lead, very similar to what we talked about in our first series from Top Esports. They had a massive lead in the final game of this series and just weren't able to do anything with it because their macro is so garbage. Nayu was somebody I was so excited to see in the LPL after his time in the LDL, and it's just been about as bad as you could ask for. He's been one of the worst junglers in the LPL, even in this carry meta that I thought he would be able to relate to better. Zora was really bad. This team has like an infatuation with him as a player. They had him as a prospect. He left to go get a starting spot on Ultra Prime. He comes back here to play with Asum over, you know, Xiaoxi, who I think is a very good support, who is signed to this team. He has not been good at all. Asum has been really not good. I mean, the definition of average to below average, like he has been the same level as somebody like 1xN over the course of this split. Vikla at times has been the worst player in the LPL, but has also at times been the only player actively trying to make plays for Rare Atom. There's just not a lot going on here. This team doesn't have a lot of good to talk about. They are not a good roster. They're 2-6 for a reason. Those 2 wins last week were solid, and I'm glad they were able to pick them up, but they are still a bottom team in the LPL, and that became abundantly clear in this series, especially with their macro. But for Ultra Prime, it's a nice win, but again, does it really change anyone's opinion on this team? This is still one of the worst teams in the LPL. This series was incredibly unclean from both of these teams, incredibly messy from both of these teams, and you know, neither of them are going to push for the playoffs. It's nice to see Uakai staying aggressive, trying to make plays, and Hacker's been okay this split, but Uakai also is going to throw away some games and throw away some moments with some of his plays, and generally this team is just not talented enough or consistent enough to ever be near the top of the standings. Again, it's nice that they picked up a win, but I don't really think it's going to matter in the grand scheme of things. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it's a battle of two teams that really have underperformed their expectations at the beginning of this split. LNG Esports taking on RNG. And LNG is going to pick up the 2-0 series win here. Obviously, this is big for LNG. They were on this horrible, horrible streak over the past couple of games where it just felt like they couldn't pick up a win anywhere. Obviously, their schedule's been really tough. They really haven't had a lot of chances to play teams around them in the standings or teams that aren't really hot right now like IG or FPX. They are finally getting into a state of their split where they're playing teams that are just worse than them, the bottom tier teams in the LPL that a lot of other teams have gotten free wins off of. So again, I imagine LNG's record is going to get a bit better, but I don't really feel significantly better about this team after this win. I just feel bad about RNG. That's really what this comes down to, is I really think RNG is this bad. I think they are not a good team. I don't think that they do really anything well, and I think that's become apparent in basically every single series that they've played. They've got one of the worst bot lanes in all of the LPL, and that alone is an accomplishment with how bad some bot lanes are. But, you know, we'll talk about them in a bit. Let's start with LNG, player of the series. Honestly, a bit difficult because this was more of a group effort, a team effort, in my opinion, than it was an individual player dominating. But I'm going to give it to Scout in the mid lane. This very much felt a lot more comfortable for Scout. Being able to win lane, actually just dominate early, isolated 1v1, and be able to translate that into mid-game success. That's really where he was finding a lot of his advantages last year when he was an MVP caliber player. That hasn't necessarily been the case this year because not only has his individual laning been worse, but we've talked about it, him and Weibo have anti-synergy in the jungle mid duo. Weibo being super aggressive, wanting to take a lot of these skirmishes. Scout has often felt like he's had to give up a lot of that prio to help Weibo out, and Weibo's not been good enough to justify that, and it doesn't necessarily work out. Both of them end up getting behind because of it, and so it's really nice to see Scout just say, screw it, I'm just going to play the 1v1 matchup. I know I'm better than Tong Yuan, who's one of the worst mid laners in the league. I'm going to dominate him, and I'm going to be better, and we're going to win this game, and that's what he was able to do. The mid games were really strong from LNG in both of these, but I do want to give a big shout out to Zika in the top lane. Breathe has been somebody who I have said is like the life point of RNG over the course of this split, really the only player on the team that has been doing anything, but this was his worst series by a pretty considerable amount. His team fighting was really awful here, and he was on both the Udyr and the Gwen, and a lot of that is Zika just getting a lot of prio in the laning phase and really being able to outplay Breathe, and that was really impressive stuff. We know Zika's a good player. It's not really shocking to hear that he had a really good series here, but it is worth noting the 2 games of Cassante. Definitely a pretty big deal. Hong already feels like a very clear upgrade in the support position. He just offers something that I think Mark doesn't. Mark is way more 2v2 lane focus oriented, and that's just not what this team wants. Hong is going to move across the map, and he's going to play Enchantress. He's going to play Renata. He's going to play Heimerdinger a bit more effectively than Mark, who wants to play these engagers, and I think it works better for this team. Not saying Mark is a bad player. I'm a bit of a Mark defender. I think he's fine, an average support at the LPL level, but Hong is definitely better than that. He's certainly better for this team in general in terms of playstyle. So really nice stuff from LNG. It's kind of crazy that in the Weibo versus Wei matchup, it's like the thing we're talking about the least, but you know, that's just how bad RNG have been, that every other part of the map has to be singled out with how not good they've been before we even talk about this funny name matchup. This bot lane is horrendous. I mean, truly, you know, I was a hater going into the year. You know, that's very well documented. I've been an LWX hater for a little while, not because I want to, but just because I feel like the perception of him has been very out of whack. And obviously, I think people are starting to come around to what I was seeing last year and the end of the year before, in the end of 2022 right now. And unfortunately, it's just not good enough. He's going to get dead of the series. He looks pretty washed. Like, I'm not going to say that he's entirely washed. Anybody can just, you know, they're one mental break away from getting back into it. LWX has been a very consistently good AD carry for a long time. You know, he wasn't good last year, but before that, he was a pretty good ADC. It just always felt like he was mentally boomed, and that has very much continued on RNG. I'm not going to say that his career is over, but mentally right now, it doesn't seem like he's in a state where he's going to be able to win. Something's got to change when it comes to him, and it's not like Ming is helping anything. Ming has been one of the worst supports in the LPL, and if that was your prediction at the beginning of the year, congratulations, you're a prophet, but like, who could have seen this coming? Who could have seen Ming being this bad coming? Some of that is LWX being a horrible laner, but a lot of that is Ming being being horrible in the mid game. Like, it's really, really crazy just how not good both of these two have been over the course of this split, and it's worth pointing out. Tong Yuan's one of the worst mid laners in the entire league. Wei has done anything but help his team because his early game pathing has been very lackadaisical. He's not really taking advantage of a lot of the even like minor advantages that his team is able to generate. And like I said, Breathe has been the life point of this team over the course of this split. He's been the one player that I feel like has been trying, but this series was awful from him. He got outplayed by Zika in basically every aspect. His team fighting was horrendous. It just feels like this team is starting to get tilted, and they're not really going to be all that good for the rest of this year. We knew that coming out of last week. I dropped them down to number 13. I wanted to put them lower, but there are a lot of bad teams in the LPL right now. If RNG keeps this up, they might even drop even lower than this. And then for LNG, again, it's a nice win, but it's not like you're beating the best of competition. I still feel pretty similarly about this team. They're probably a bottom-end playoff team. Like I was talking about at the end of last week, I expect them to start cleaning up on the worst teams in the league and get their record a little bit closer to 500, but with what they have shown so far this year against actual good teams, this doesn't change my thought process at all about them not really being a contender at all in 2024. And then moving on to day number 4, our middle day of the week, technically here. And this is when we start our super days, our 3 series days. So a lot to cover the rest of the way. And we kick it off with a true banger. FunPlus Phoenix taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas. And another FPX upset at the start of this week as they take down NIP, who was first in the standings at 7-1. This is massive. This FPX team is really starting to show that they are legit. And specifically, Milky Way is showing that he is going to be a breakout star in the LPL. I can't remember a time where we had a week like this so far, where you have one player who has really been very good up until this point, but just solidify that by dominating some of the better teams in the league. It's not even over yet. The schedule gets harder as the week goes on, but FPX has looked really, really good, and Milky Way is the star. He is the carry. He's certainly not the only player on this team playing well. We'll talk about it in just a second, but for NIP, again, I talked about this a lot last week when it came to NIP. There was so much discussion around them being overrated or overvalued. Their schedule was weak. They're not a real 7-1 team. Okay, great. Okay, maybe they're overvalued at 7-1. Maybe they're not a top 1, top 2 team. Do you think they're top 4? Okay, well, if you don't think they're top 4, who's top 4? FPX might be top 4, as we've seen with them winning this, but outside of that, who? Is it Weibo? Is it WE? Is it LNG? That's always been my argument, is all of these people like to claim that NIP's not top 4 without putting out a single name of who they actually think is better than NIP, because none of those other teams have proven anything. NIP has actually proven a lot, and I think they've been better than people have said they have been over the beginning part of this split, as is indicative by their record. But yeah, their schedule's been a little easy, and FPX just beat them here, but FPX is on a roll. This might be one of the best teams in the LPL, so let's talk about it. Player of the series, come on, it's Milky Way. 18, 3, and 10 on Lee Sin and Graves. I mean, this dude is just breaking every game wide open super early on. His aggressive plays, his ability to outplay his opponents with his crazy mechanics. I was a big Milky Way fan coming into the LPL split. You know, I'm not going to try and sit here and say that I predicted this or anything, because obviously I didn't. That would be ridiculous for me to say. Nobody thought Milky Way was going to be this. He wasn't even my number 1 rookie jungler. That was Nayu over on Rare Adam, which obviously has aged horribly. Like, I'm not immune to bad takes, and I'm not saying that I 100% perfectly predicted this, but his tape was really good, and I really wanted them to play him over Moyan, who, you know, I talked about that in the primer, and I'm really glad they did, but even I, who was like a big fan, could have never in a million years predicted this in year 1 for Milky Way. Like, is this guy a top 3, 4 jungler in the LPL? Like, that's a real conversation to be having. He is destroying games against very good teams, and it's crazy fun to watch. He dominated here. Love him on Graves. I love LPL junglers on Marksman, and I think generally Marksman junglers are a lot stronger than they get credit for right now. Graves, Kindred, they are dominating the meta, even in other regions, but especially here in the LPL. When good players get to pick them, they really take over games, and Milky Way is very much a good player. But the one unsung hero on this FPX team that nobody is talking about, I mean, at least that I've seen, that has genuinely been incredible, is Life in the support position. I mean, I get it. Like, people are really sour on him from last year because Viper has a lot of fans, and he was really bad in Viper's bot lane, and so he's immediately going to get lambasted and chastised by a lot of fans. But, dude, this guy's been incredible throughout this split so far. He has been a big reason why FPX has been this good. He, in my opinion, has very, very clearly been the second best player on this team. He was unkillable, and yes, some of that is the Senna. You probably should have banned out Senna after that game number 1 when Maokai was unkillable, and now you've got an unkillable Ornn that's just giving everybody free stats in the late game. But Life did such a good job at being a disruptor in this series, and we know he can play enchanters at a super high level as well. This guy has really refound his form, and he's one of the best supports in the LPL right now. I don't know if that's going to continue, but in terms of performances, he has been awesome so far in 2024, and I don't think he's getting the publicity that he deserves. Dectum was really good. Senna's crazy broken. Kara had good ultimates. He just doesn't have to do a whole ton because Milky Way is the carry here. Again, Kara's really settled nicely into that supportive role, and Zhao Lao, who's not great on the top side of this map, but it doesn't really matter because everybody else is clicking. This bot lane is working, specifically Life is working. Milky Way's a hyper carry that can win you any game if given the right resources, and Care is really fitting nicely into that supportive mid role. FPX has found a very clear strategy, and they are beating everybody with it right now. And then for NIP, am I going to freak out about this loss? Not entirely. I don't think this is a horrible loss. FPX is just on fire, and Milky Way was the best player in this series, but I would have liked to have seen better play coming out from a couple sides of this map. Dud of the game and Dud of the series is going to go to Rookie in the mid lane. He was useless on Orianna, and Rookie's been amazing this split. He's been one of the best players in the LPL, has consistently outperformed even really good mid laners in 1v1 matchups, has been a great team fighter. He's done everything he's been asked to do in the mid lane. It just wasn't a very good series for him. I mean, I'm not going to freak out about that because he's been so good and because it feels like he is so comfortable. What is a bit concerning is Fodik and Juo, who really aren't stars by any means. Fodik has definitely had a bit of a breakout split in my opinion. I know people are going to talk about Victory 5 in 2022, but as I talked about in all of 2022, essentially in that year, I thought he was very overhyped. I thought he got a lot of assistance and help from the really good players around him, like PP God, like Rookie, and I just didn't think he really had to do a whole ton. I thought he's been playing better. He's actually been a pretty strong side AD carry over the course of this split. Wasn't very good in this series, and Juo was also not very good in this series, and Juo's someone that I'm actually concerned about. Really has not had a great start to the year, even with Fodik playing well. I think Juo sometimes gets a worse rap than he deserves because of his past on TES. He improved a lot last year, I thought, for NIP, and I understood why they wanted to bring him back, but it was a concern, and that concern is starting to come out in the big games. Now, Shanji was very good this series, but he was going into Zhao Laohu, who is just not a very good top laner, and Shanji's really not been the game breaker that he was on OMG throughout 2024 anyways, and so there are concerns about whether NIP is going to be like a relatively decent team, but like this is a top 6 or 5 team at absolute worst. Like there is no argument to be made about that just because the LPL isn't particularly good right now, and I think NIP, this loss sucks for them, but they're going to have to bounce back. For FPX though, like what's the ceiling for this team? Could this be a Worlds team? Like in their current state, maybe. Like they're beating everybody that is kind of on the cusp of being a Worlds team. Do I just skyrocket them up in the standings? I don't really know. Like Milky Way is awesome, but I want to see him continue to do this for a whole split. We've seen breakout junglers in the past in the LPL, and not all of them have been able to sustain it. Some of them have, but not all of them, and I need to see him, do it for a whole split and not just for a couple of weeks. Life has been awesome. Dectum's very consistent. Care has been good. Top lane's a concern, but FPX is a very scary team, and I don't think anybody in the league wants to play them right now. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4 here, and a battle of two teams that are really trying to find their footing, one more so than the other in this rebuild year, I guess, for them. Edward Gaming taking on OMG. OMG picking up the 2-1 series win. You don't love that they dropped game number 2, but honestly, there were parts of EDG that have been playing better as of late, as is evidenced by their win last week, but OMG is definitely the better of these two teams, and really the only way that EDG was ever going to stay in this series is if they accidentally got a ton of gold on the Snake, who was playing relatively well on a very strong champion in Varus, but OMG was better in most of this series, and even in game number 2, for a lot of that game, OMG had a lot going for them. It's a pretty decent series. I just don't feel super confident in OMG. This team fails to really, push me forward. It's very nice to see a group of players that I think a lot of people wrote off kind of come together and really just make something good. I was a lot higher on this team, I think, than others. I thought they were going to be a playoff team going into the year, and even though I don't feel good at all about having them number 7 in my power rankings, because what the hell is the LPL right now? There are just not that many good teams in the LPL. I'm really glad that OMG is at least a competent, 500 org, and that's kind of what we expected. So let's talk about it. Player of the series, obviously, for me, is going to go to Angel in the mid lane. Awesome series from him. He has been the driving force of OMG over the course of 2024, just as he was for Ninjas and Pyjamas last year. This guy is going to go consistently underrated. I was never a huge fan of his back in the day on Suning when, he made World Finals and, on Weibo when they transitioned into that organization. I actually thought he was a bit overrated. I always thought he was just kind of an okay mid laner who was not great in lane, but was pretty good at enabling the rest of his team. Kind of a worse version of Yagao, in my opinion, and that wasn't something that I considered super valuable in the LPL back in the day. But then he goes and he leaves Weibo, he goes to RNG, and things are a disaster there. He can't even secure a starting spot over Tong Yuan, who, as we just talked about, is one of the worst mid laners in the LPL. And then he goes to NIP in the summer split because that team just wants to go young. And he dominates. He's amazing for NIP last year, and him and Shadow have great chemistry. He's really able to do a lot with a lot of resources as a carry in the mid lane, which is not really the role that he filled at any other point in his career, and that was really impressive. So I was interested to see what happened when he came over here to OMG after winning NIP a playoff series, essentially, and he has been as advertised. He's basically been the same player that he was for summer of last year, and that's awesome for Angel. This is one of the more complete mid laners in the entire league, somebody with World Finals experience. They're happy to have him, for sure. Xiao Feng obviously helps a lot because his, kind of emergence as a pretty good young LPL jungler is really nice to see. He's not on the same level as, someone like Milky Way that we just talked about being a great LPL jungler, but, Xiao Feng's really good, and him and Angel have very good chemistry. I think they're going to continue to grow. Angel has gotten a bit more into that, supportive, more facilitative mid kind of style that he was really known for at the beginning part of his career when he was playing with, SOFM, and I think Xiao Feng kind of fills that carry jungle role very well in this instance, and I think it really does play off of each other very well. The bot lane was also very good. PP God in particular was really nice in game number 1 on the Nautilus, was just everywhere. We'll talk about Shamu coming in for EDG and not really living up at all in game number 1. You're looking for basically anything on this roster to be able to play, but they don't have a playable support, and PP God took advantage of that. One of his better, if not his best series of the year. He has been a pretty big disappointment so far. He's having one of his bad years, very similar to his Bilibili year, in my opinion, where things just didn't necessarily work out. Abel, I think, has also regressed, but he was pretty good in this series. Ezreal's a champion that I think works for this team in terms of how they want to play, even if it's not a signature Abel pick. I think something like Tristana obviously fits a bit better in terms of Abel's, 3 big champions of, Tristana, Samira, and Aphelios, but, Abel's fine, and I think PP God, if he can get back on track, could be good, and then even if Cube isn't particularly good on the top side, as long as he survives, then OMG is going to be able to win games. Mid-jungle has been the MO for a lot of teams in the LPL, and OMG is certainly no different there. And then for EDG on the other side, they've been making some positive strides. I would say the Snake has certainly been playing better as of late, no matter who's in the support position. Jamu came in game number 1 and was really, really bad. PP God just completely outclassed him and outplayed him moving around the map and creating panic on the Nautilus versus Rel matchup, and so they put Vampire back in, who has been the worst support in the LPL, or is certainly one of the worst players in the LPL, and, he was okay in game 2. You had opportunities to be able to set up for the Varus, which is just a ridiculously broken champion right now, but game 3 really kind of came back down to earth for Vampire. The spot lane is not good, and even if the Snake is making developments, which is good to see, I just think the support position is never really going to be a positive. But dud of the series for me is going to go to Fisher. The mid gap here was pretty large. Fisher's actually been making some positive strides as well. I've talked about that in the previous weeks. He was awful at the start of the split, but his laning has gotten at least a little bit better, even if he really hasn't done anything with it. But he got outplayed in lane hard by Angel in this series, and there really wasn't a lot to do. Fisher played really bad, and he's not been a particularly good mid. I compare him a lot to Tong Yuan. I think they're very similar in terms of how they play matchups. And this predictably went very in favor of Angel. Even if Fisher is getting better, it's not by a lot, and he's certainly not anywhere above a below average mid laner at this level. I think Monkey is interesting, and I think Ale obviously is the one player that you're expecting to actually be able to win on this team, as was evidenced by their one series win, but, I don't expect EDG to get anything better than, 14th place this split. This is a rebuilding split, and it's very clear. And then for OMG, this is a playoff team, because there aren't a lot of playoff teams, but, number 7 feels ridiculously high. I like Angel, and Xiao Feng's been coming along well. If Abel and PP God can lock in, this could be a top 7-ish team in the LPL. I just don't think they have anybody that really wows me. If Angel's your best player, you probably should be somewhere around 8th or 9th or 10th. I like Angel, and he can be the best player on a playoff team, but right now I feel like we're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop against some of the better teams in the league, and, as much as OMG is kind of an interesting team to watch, I don't think they're going to be elite at any point this year. And then moving on to our third series of day number 4, and it's another series that some would consider an upset, me included. Weibo Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend, and AL picking up another very, very important win for them. They're going to move to 6-3 on the start of this year. This team does have their own individual problems. They're certainly not perfect, but they have a lot of good things going for them as well, and honestly, a lot of the teams around the upper middle of the standings, LNG and Weibo Gaming, and, even Ninjas and Pyjamas to an extent, OMG, it's not like they're powerhouses at the current moment. moment. Teams like AL have a real opportunity to be able to take some of those spots and move up the standings if they continue to look good, but for Weibo, this team just has no consistency. There is so much going wrong with how they play the game at the current moment that it's just losing them a lot of tempo, it's losing them a lot of pressure, and the reunion of the top side of the map here for Weibo's players did not go according to plan. We will talk about it in a bit, but for AL, starting off with them, player of the series, once again going to go to Shanks. This guy's dominated the last, 3 weeks of the LPL. He has really kind of exploded. He was really good on WE, and he would have series where he was really taking over, but I think there's an argument to be made that he's currently kind of in the midst of potentially his best split ever. He has really been a hyper carry for AL so far, and a lot of the positivity surrounding AL was because of Shanks coming over to this team, the WE carry duo coming over from last year, and so far it's been Shanks that has really kind of made that work. The Tristana in game number 3 was dominant. He was everywhere on the map, picking up kill after kill after kill, and just snowballed the game out of control to not allow Weibo to be able to fight. I think his ability to win lane as hard as he did across this entire series was the reason AL was able to win it, and so credit to Shanks. He's truly one of the better mid laners in the LPL at the moment. I don't know if that's going to last. I think he's, there are a lot of good mid laners in the LPL, and that's not a negative to Shanks. I think he's a great player, but, it's just hard to imagine he's going to finish better than a lot of the other mids that are around him, but he is a really good player, potentially top 5 in terms of his role at the moment. I also want to give a big shout out to Hope and Kale. I thought both of them played really well here. Hope had one of his more consistent series of the year. He got to play the Ziggs in game 3, but it was the Lucian games that I think really stood out to me in terms of his ability to play early and to play the skirmishes really well. It's kind of really interesting to watch how different AD carry players play Lucian, because he is a bit more of a burst assassin than he is a marksman, and so you do have to be more aggressive, and Hope not necessarily somebody who's known for his aggression in terms of how he plays AD carry, but he was able to pilot that champion well. Kale was really good. I think if you do have a criticism towards AL, it's that Krako was maybe a little bit too much at times in this series. Krako is really determined to come over here and be either the game winner or the game loser. There were a lot of series early in the year that Krako just straight up won for AL because of his aggressive plays and his ability to outplay his opponents, and now there are also going to be some situations where the enemy jungler is really good, and you're going to have situations where he's getting himself caught in situations where he doesn't need to be caught in, and that's going to happen. He's just a little more aggressive than he was really at any time in the LCK. Sometimes the LPL does that to players, but he feels very feast or famine, and that could be a concern for AL, but for the most part, he is more talented than a lot of the junglers in the league, and so he does get away with it in most instances, even if some of the deaths in this series were very inty. I think especially because Miz can have so much prio, because Shanks is such a good laner. Hope and Kale have been pretty good, even if I don't think they're stars, and Harry has been better over the second part of the beginning of this split, rather than, really what he was at the beginning, which was not very good, and so AL's kind of settled into this nice place. I don't think they're a super team, but I think that they are relatively good, and for Weibo, obviously, it's really hard to tell or get a grip on where this team is sitting, because they fluctuate so often between good and bad, that you really never know which version of this team you're going to get on any given series, but this honestly felt like an Anyone's Legend series from 2020, where Zhao Hao was doing a lot of really good work in the jungle, was taking advantage of some weaknesses and some positioning errors from the enemy team, and he just had nobody else on this team to be able to capitalize. Zhao, who's going to get done to the series, mid lane was a train wreck for Weibo. He's just too slow, and honestly, I don't really know what it is. The Nico game was reportable in game number 2, and he wasn't particularly good on the Orianna in game 3 either. Zhao, who's not having a good split. I defended him a lot last year because even if his laning wasn't great, his team fighting actually was very good, but he's not even getting to the team fight stage, and I don't think it's particularly because he has gotten worse there, but because, first of all, laners in the mid lane have gotten better over the course of this offseason, especially in that mid position, but I also think that the team around him doesn't want to play slow and controlled and try to get to the late game. I think that this team wants to push the tempo, and Zhao just isn't really fitting in that mold, and I think that's why he's struggling, but it wasn't just him. ZDZ got obliterated, really not a particularly good player, and I think we're starting to learn that, a below-average top laner. I think at best, you were hoping to get a stable top laner that wasn't going to lose nearly as much as the Shy did, but also wasn't going to win in any ways that the Shy did. ZDZ has just kind of been a worse version of the Shy in the fact that he's losing just as hard as the Shy was losing for most of the regular season last year, but he's not giving any of the good moments that the Shy would offer, and so that's not a positive. Light and Crisp had a bad series. That's going to happen every once in a while. They have been the best players on this team. Crisp, in particular, has really been the only player that has been consistent at all, and he wasn't good this series, but it happens, and then, like I said, Zhao Hao was good against his former org, the one that he had played for the last couple of years, but it just wasn't enough because the rest of his lanes were losing. Weibo's a weird team. Do I think they're going to be a playoff team? I sure would hope so, but it's really not locked in. Again, it's the reason why I say that the top of the LPL standings are so wide open because teams like Weibo occupy spots in the power rankings around number 6. I don't know how good this team is going to be for the rest of the year, but right now they're not good. And then for AL, this is a good team. Again, I don't think they're a great team. I think they rely a lot on Shanks. I don't really think they have another star carry. Kale's a good player, but he's really not emerged as a star. Hope is fine, but he's more of an average AD carry than a star. Krako is certainly going to flip games, and Harry has not been consistent at all. I think AL is a good team, mostly because Shanks is really good, but I would expect them to struggle against some of the better teams in the league. This feels like a team that is closer to a first round out than they are to a top 5 team, but they do feel pretty locked in for the playoffs, which is better than anything AL has been able to say in a long time. And then moving on to day number 5 now, and we kick day 5 off actually with a patch change, going from 14.2 to 14.4 in the middle of the week, which is strange, but we got to see it in action right away as we saw LGD Gaming taking on Bilibili Gaming, and BLG is going to pick up the 2-0 series win in this one. And like I said, we got to see the new patch in action. Smolder is enabled starting on 14.4 in the LPL, and Elk plays it in game number 1 and is able to pop off. Obviously, we've been able to see Smolder in some competitive action over in North America already because they play on live patch both in the LCS and in the NACL, and it's really looked strong in that region. A champion that is so consistently able to deal a lot of damage in team fights is very valuable, especially when games are going a bit longer now than they were last year. It's really nice to see, or it's really nice, I should say, to have an option like Smolder where you can play it into things like Senna and actually be able to scale into it relatively well. It's not really an option that you had as much before. There are hyper-scaling ADCs, but Smolder is clearly the best in the game, in my opinion, at the current moment in terms of that role, and Elk piloted it great. BLG looked really good. LGD definitely, put up a fight in this one. A couple of players in particular looked solid, but, there's only so much you can do when you are LGD going up against Bilibili. That's just going to end up being the case. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series obviously is going to go to Elk in both games. It's not just the Smolder game in game 1. It's the Varus game in game 2 where he was just able to take over in terms of the damage that he was offering out. And that's big. I mean, Elk has really started to pick his pace back up, I would say, in the last couple of weeks. Last week was really the start of that in that series against JD Gaming, where obviously it's super important for him to be able to keep his, momentum up against a team like that. If you're not as good as Ruler, then you're not going to be able to win that series nearly as easily, and Elk was phenomenal there. Good to see him carry that over into this LGD series against a team that isn't, JD Gaming. It's nice to see him still take series like this very seriously, and it's nice that Elk is playing well. On was really starting off the season hot, but Elk was kind of slower to the draw, in my opinion. Nice to see both of them online now. Knight definitely needs to work a bit on his way, but he was really good on the Ahri in game 1. I saw some comments on social media that Knight's not been very good this split. I don't know what games anyone's watching. I get it. Recency bias. I say this every week. Recency bias is the strongest thing in esports. It's a lot stronger than any sort of actual gameplay. Knight was the single best player in the LPL for the first 3 weeks. I don't think that's even really all that up for debate. I get it. He's not been as dominant in the last 2 weeks because a lot more attention has been put on the bot lane, but Knight is still the best player in the LPL. He just didn't play Hui very well, and it might not be a champion that he continues to pull out, but the Ahri game was awesome in game number 1, and it's not like he was miserable in game 2. It's just, for his standard, it wasn't quite as good. June continues to look like maybe the best jungler in the LPL at the current moment. The only concern with BLG is Bin in the top lane. He had a great series earlier in the week, but this was not a good series from him. He got outplayed in this one by Bertle, who was just straight up better than him, and I'm a big Bertle fan. I've said it a lot on this channel. I think that he's very undervalued. I thought he was very good for Sandbox up until his mental got destroyed in the summer split, and generally he was never given a fair shake on Damwon because of the expectations of that team, but, he's been good for LGD, and this is just kind of something that this team does. You get the most out of certain players. Bertle, I think, is just kind of playing exactly the same as he has been over the past year, and now people are just saying it's better because the expectations are lower. I honestly think that is just kind of the circumstance that you have. We've seen it with Wayward, we've seen it with a couple of other players. Morgan's another one in the LCK. Top laners sometimes get weird expectations that they can't always live up to on teams that maybe want to really win. Once they get into an environment and a situation where those expectations are removed, some of the positives that they've always had can be, further spotlighted, and I think that's happening to Bertle, but, the rest of the team was okay here. I think Haichao continues to look very good in the mid lane. Not going to say he's a star or anything, but he has definitely turned into a solid LPL mid laner across this split so far. He's been very easy to play. I think Meteor is actually worse than he's been last year, but again, it's kind of apples to oranges. How much of that is that he has so much responsibility on this team and that, he's just having to do a lot of the work and he ends up, being in bad positions because of it. It's really kind of hard to say. Xiaoye and Jinzhao definitely took their steps back into kind of what we expected from them in this series. Jinzhao getting dud of the series for me. I don't think he was like the worst player of all time, but I certainly think the Ashe in game 2 was not good, and he wasn't great on Maokai in game 1 either. Meteor definitely could have gotten it here in the jungle, because Jun was definitely better than him, was moving around the map, was definitely causing a lot more chaos, and I'm kind of low on what Meteor has offered over the course of this split, but Jin Zhao was probably worse across both games. Meteor had a much better game 2 than he did at game 1, but Bertle was definitely a standout. Haichao's been solid. Xiaoye is starting to develop, some level of play here at the LPL level, which is not something he had at the beginning of this split. LGD's fine. I see a lot of people saying like, oh, this team might actually be a sneaky playoff team or a sleeper for the playoffs. No, I'm sorry, I get it. They're up near 12 or 13 in terms of the power rankings because there just aren't a lot of good teams in the LPL right now, but this is not a good team. They're just better than the worst teams in the league. That makes you think they're interesting. This is not a playoff team. They're not even close to it. They have some interesting pieces, but they can't win games, and that's kind of what you need to do in order to make the playoffs. But like I said, for Bilibili, if Bin can get on track, this is the best team in the world because everything else is working. Jun and Knight are playing off each other great. Even if they haven't been as dominant as they were in the first couple of weeks, that's kind of a testament to how good they were in the first couple of weeks. That now that there's more pressure on the bot lane, now that you can put more attention there, Knight and Jun can just kind of survive. And Elk and On have been much better, I would say, over the past 2 weeks. And so a lot of good for BLG. Generally, this is maybe the best team in the world, especially with how inconsistent so many teams are at the current moment. They bounced back from their one and only loss this split very well. And I really like what they're doing in terms of the style that they end up playing. Then moving on to our second series of day number 5, and it is a good one. It is Top Esports taking on Invictus Gaming. And Top Esports is going to pick up a very needed victory in this one. The series was really fun to watch. I think game 1 was very back and forth. A lot of good stuff happening from both teams. But TES definitely was the team coming out on top. Invictus destroys game number 2. They look amazing putting You Should Know Me on something that can be super aggressive. Wink on Blitzcrank and just moving him everywhere around the map to create these panic spots. Leon on Nidalee, his signature pick. But then, we were in the kitchen a little too long in game number 3. Fiora, Nidalee, Renekton, Senna, Sejuani is the draft for Invictus in game 3, and Top Esports say, okay, well, we're going to pick Ornn Karma, and we're going to not take any damage from your low damage comp, and they won the game. They had a Varus, and they were pretty easily able to win from there. They just targeted down the Senna to make sure she can never stay online, and it was pretty simple. It was the most dominating game of the series, so credit to Top Esports. Maybe Invictus actually had a chance to win this series, and the entire narrative around both of these teams very much changes if IG wins this game, but they didn't. They drafted this and they lost, and it is what it is. They misplayed in a lot of crucial areas as well. It wasn't just the draft that they lost from, but they certainly didn't do themselves any favors by putting that in the by starting the game in that respect. But let's talk about TES. Player of the series for me is going to go to Mako in the bot lane. Milio, Rakan, really good stuff coming in from him. He's been amazing across this split so far, and I thought he was really integral towards what this team did this series. I think Wink was also very good on the other side of this. I talked about Blitzcrank being huge in game number 2. This really was which support was going to get more prio and which support was going to have more pressure early. That was really going to determine how this series ended up turning out, and Mako was the one who ended up winning that in the third and final game, with the Rakan just being everywhere on the map. Those engages were near perfect, and when Mako was on, he's just one of the best supports in the world, and it's not particularly close. Really fun stuff from him. Jackie Love obviously following up on the Varus in game 3, but we have to shout out the game 2 on the Lucian, where he kind of ran it a bit. Jackie Love has these games. I'm not particularly surprised, but 90% of his games are so good that you can excuse the 10% of games that are just not as good, which, if you get game 1 and game 3 and then game 2, this is a fine series from Jackie Love, even if game 2 was a disaster. 369 continues to be awesome. Love the Ornn pick. I think Ornn is very undervalued in the meta right now. I think he's tankier than people realize just because he doesn't do a ton of damage like the other tanks like Cassante or Gnar or things like that. Maybe he's not going to be highly prioritized or as highly prioritized as those picks, but I think Ornn is in a really good spot, and I think 369 really showed that in game 3 as the counter, quote-unquote, to Fiora alongside the Karma, which made it basically impossible to kill him. Cream was solid. Tian was very, very good in this series. I actually think Tian is going to fly under the radar for how good he was in this series. Definitely was a huge factor in game number 1 towards why that game was very in favor of Top Esports. I just think they played well. This is a nice bounce back after losing to FPX earlier in the week. You face these two up-and-coming teams that not a lot of people expected in the same week, and you're able to go 1-1. Obviously, you would have loved to go 2-0 being a top team, but you can live with some losses here or there. You're not expecting this team to be perfect, but I still expect them to be very good. And then for IG on the other side, this is still a good team. They probably could have won this series. I think there were a couple players that played great here. Wink and Leon continue to look amazing. Wink, like I said, looked great in game 2, and I thought he was the best player on this team throughout this entire series. But Leon, pretty consistent. You know, he's a Nidalee player. That's kind of something that he's very known for. A lot of junglers here in the LPL are known for their Nidalee. I would have liked to see him reel it in a bit more in game number 3. Perhaps actually try and make some positive plays instead of just kind of waiting for his top laner to die and then trying to do something. Same thing with this mid laner. But, you know, done of the series pretty obviously is going to go to On. If anybody watched game number 3, it's just death after death after death on the Senna. His Draven was really good in game 2, and, you know, he kind of was okay in game 1, but, I mean, he was miserable, like 0-8 in game number 3, unwinnable in game number 3, and I get it, the draft is really hard, but you rely a lot on Senna in that draft to actually enable this kind of tankier comp of Sedge, Renekton, Fiora, and you just couldn't do that. Like, you wanted to be in side lanes, you needed that Senna to be strong, and he was so weak by the time we hit 10 minutes, the game was basically over. There was no way for IG to play out that draft from there. Like I said, You Should Know Me and Cryan weren't particularly good, so it's not like it was just On that lost them this series, but it certainly didn't help. For IG, I think they're fine. Again, this is just a loss. You can take a loss every once in a while, even if it's in a situation you would have liked to have seen a win in, especially when you can kind of chalk it up to a bad draft, like you can chalk this one up. You know, I would like to see them bounce back next week and continue to prove that they are a top 6-ish team in the LPL. I think that's very realistic for them, but Top Esports is very good. Losing to them, there is absolutely no shame in that. It's a nice bounce back from TES. Mako continues to look great. Tion has had a very good split. 369 is playing phenomenal, maybe the best top laner in the LPL right now. And it's not like Jackie Love and Cream have been bad. Jackie Love's been very good, and Cream, I think, has stabilized himself and certainly filled a role in the mid lane. TES is a very good team, and this is more of what I expected rather than their first series of the week. And then moving on to our third series of day number 5, our final series of the 5th day, a top team, bottom team clash, JD Gaming taking on Thunder Talk Gaming, and JDG does get the job done 2-0, not particularly difficult in either of these games. There were moments where a couple of players made things interesting. I should say UCal made things interesting, as he almost always does in these games, but JDG is just better across the board. Even with UCal being very good, Yagao is probably better than UCal, so there's really not a lot of advantages for TT2 kind of generate in this series, and JDG got the job done, honestly, pretty cleanly. I wish they would have ended games a little bit cleaner, but that's just something that this team and this org has always kind of been bad at, and they've been bad at it this year so far. It's certainly something that I'm looking at when it comes to playing against the best teams in the world, but for now, I'm willing to overlook it because their individual early game plays are just so good. They're able to generate leads against basically anybody, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series, to me, obviously goes to Kanavi. I mean, massive jungle gap in this series. Beishuan is just horrendous right now. There's no other way to put it. He's been the worst player in the LPL. This guy has just not been able to play at all. His mechanics are dead. His mental is clearly gone. You know, we'll talk about him when we get there, but Kanavi is the kind of player that's going to take advantage of that and be everywhere on the map. Is going to say, oh yeah, you're not going to be as sharp mentally. You're not going to be as quick on the draw when it comes to these plays. Well, I'm going to be everywhere and I'm going to decimate you and the game's going to be over by 15 minutes. And that's kind of how it felt, especially game number 2 on that rel, where it just was demolition. It was such good stuff coming in from Kanavi. He's very quietly been phenomenal, like maybe the best jungler in the LPL. Obviously, there's pretty big competition for that. June, I mean, hell, even Milky Way has been so good this split, but Kanavi's definitely in the conversation for that, for what he's been able to do, and he was great in this series. He's been great this week. Obviously, the other player that you want to point out if you watch these games is Flandre. Received a lot of attention in this series. He's been receiving a lot of attention. He's not somebody who plays weak side particularly well, but when he is able to win, when he's able to go up against someone like Hoya, who just loses in every single matchup, he's able to generate these massive leads and be super influential in team fights. Flandre has been very good for this team this split. I still think he's been one of the better top laners, even if in some series he's been a little bit more exploitable than maybe someone like 369 would have been last year for this team. Flandre's still very good. Yagao was very good. Ruler was awesome in this series, basically untouchable in a lot of this, series, both of these matchups. Playing Lucian into Caitlyn isn't always the easiest matchup in the entire world, especially Caitlyn Milio. It's very difficult to end up landing onto Caitlyn there, but Ruler is so good in lane that it didn't really matter. He was basically undealable with, and the mid-game skirmishes that he took alongside the Xin Zhao and the Rel in both games respectively really blew the game wide open. So credit to Ruler, he's amazing. He continues to be amazing, and Missing was great too. It's just across the board a really good series for JDG. They dominated, but Kanavi, Flandre, Ruler, definitely the three that I think stood out the most for me. And then for Thunder Talk on the other side, it really was like a 1v9 for a bit of this series with UCal, but UCal wasn't perfect either. Could have been a bit more aggressive, I guess, on the Azir, but everybody else was just not good. Beishwan is once again going to get done of the series. He has been horrid in 2024. I was very much, I've said this, a Beishwan defender in 2022, and especially in 2023, where I thought he was better than he got credit for. He definitely was better in 2022, but, you know, people really turned on him last year, and people wanted to see Zhao Huangren, even though Zhao Huangren wasn't doing particularly well in the LDL. I think this team needs a new jungler, like ASAP. Clearly, whatever is going on with Beishwan needs to be fixed by him getting confidence somewhere else, because it's not going to happen on this team, and there are a lot of good junglers available. Maybe someone like Tarzan, like, could this team be a playoff team? I don't even think it's still out of the realm of possibility. There still are open slots, but you got to make a decision sooner rather than later. Hoya is also close to unplayable on the top side. There are a lot of bad top laners in the LPL. Decade definitely comes to mind, but Hoya is probably second worst above Decade, maybe even below him. I mean, Decade has more positive upside than Hoya does, and neither of them win at all, but he's just such a bad laner. He's such a bad team fighter. He's just not very good at this point in his career. 1xN tried his best, I guess, but he was playing Caitlyn and Illusion and was doing literally nothing in lane, and so you got to criticize him for that. He has been, again, not good this split. Like, it's not just Beishwan and Hoya that are underperforming. 1xN has been bad. Chocho's had a couple of good games, and he wasn't really all that bad in this series, but didn't really do anything, and like I said, UCal had some good moments, but couldn't actually follow it up with anything. This is just not a good Thunder Talk team, especially in comparison to the team that they were playing in this series. This isn't a particularly shocking outcome for Thunder Talk in comparison to JD Gaming, but this team is not good. They are a bottom tier team for a reason. And then JDG, you know, this is awesome. This is a great win, but, you know, it's all about the top tier matchups. Beating Thunder Talk is cool, and you should be able to do that, but, you know, this is expected. There's not really a lot to glean from this series except JDG good. What a shock. Then moving on now to day number 6, our penultimate day here in week number 5, and we kick day 6 off with a traditionally pretty competitive rivalry matchup, but one that isn't necessarily so good right now between WE and RNG, and WE is going to get the advantage here. The better team is going to win in this one. RNG continues their death spiral down the standings, but WE actually looks pretty good. Maybe they're not like the best team in the LPL, but they're certainly consistent enough to be a threat to some of the top teams, especially with a team like Ninjas and Pyjamas not exactly coming out in week number 5 and looking amazing so far. WE, like, who's to say they couldn't be a top 4 team if everything were to go right? I've had them at number 5 in my power rankings, and I think that's a pretty reasonable place for them to be at the current moment. Like, obviously, they're better than Weibo and OMG and the teams that I have directly below them. You know, we're going to be moving up some other teams as the weekends here, but WE is a strong team, and they've got a true MVP contender and maybe even front runner right now with Wayward in the top lane, who's just been ridiculously good this season. But for RNG, like I said, the death spiral, it's just going down and down and down. It is not good for them right now. They're kind of learning the hard way that you can't just rely on signing veterans that other teams don't want to build a team. That's not really a way to make things work. I think their bot lane has been a disaster, and I'm not necessarily condemning the offseason process for trying to bring these guys in. Even I, who was a big LWX hater going into the year, thought it would be better than this. It's just not been good, but mid lane, the experiment, it's failed. There's no other way to put it. Wei is past his prime. Breathe has checked out mentally, and something's going wrong with Ming, and I don't really know what it is, but we'll get to that in a second. WE, player of the series, it's Wayward in the top lane. This guy just dominates games. His laning phase is so ridiculous, and he knows exactly what to do with resources when he is able to get it in the early game. I don't really think there is another LPL top laner that I would consider quite as strong side this split as Wayward. There really aren't teams that play for top lane anywhere near the way that WE ends up playing for top lane, and I think obviously it's helped Wayward out a ton, but he's such a talented player. He's very good in isolated matchups. He's played weak side his entire career, so he knows what he's supposed to do in any given situation. He's got this weird kind of middle ground of experience where he came into the league on Top Esports as this more carry-oriented, you know, hyped prospect, but never really got any resources on teams that were trying to compete with superstars like Knight and Tion in year 1, and obviously Jackie Love as well, and so never really got the resources he needed, so he learned how to play weak side. Now he is getting those resources, but he hasn't stopped knowing how to be safe. It's a really good combination of skills, and I think it's really put Wayward near the top of the top lane rankings. This is a player who I was always high on. Had him as an All-Pro in 2022, definitely Rookie of the Year for me that year, and I'm really glad to see that despite the scapegoatism that he encountered on Top Esports, despite the fact that, he would have some bad games here or there, that he can break through that and kind of get back into a good situation here on a team with less expectations than maybe TES had for many years. But it's not just him. Hang had a much better series here. He's been the weakness of this team, but he just straight up out-jungled Wei. Wei had a couple of good moments in this series. They tried to dump a lot of gold and experience into that Jackson game number 2, but Hang did a really good job of keeping that from getting out of control, and it was nice to see him just generally have a good early game. That's what he was known for coming up from the LDL. It's nice to see that he can still get back to that, even if he hasn't been very good at the split. Stay is really good. I don't know. Again, I feel so bad for Prince because he really shouldn't be on the bench in the LPL, but Stay is awesome. This is a really good pickup and a really good find, a really good promotion from WE, because this guy's come in and been like a top half AD carry in every single game that he's played. He was so good on the Jhin in particular in game 2, but, TF bot is something that doesn't really work. We've not really seen it work in pro. Obviously it works really well in solo queue. I'm not trying to say this champion is weak by any means, but, as I talked about earlier this week, it's been a lot more effective in the solo lanes. Stay made it look broken in game number 1. It's just really good stuff. Fofo looked great against a bad mid laner in Tong Yuan. Wandy is really solid and has significantly better chemistry with Stay than he did with Prince. WE's a really interesting team to watch because they play around that top side, and not a lot of teams are prepared to deal with that, and they have very well-rounded players across the board. It's what makes them so dangerous in a league of teams that have pretty clear weaknesses. I would say that WE doesn't really have that, in my opinion, right now. But for RNG on the other side, again, their players are just kind of mentally checked out and underperforming. You can maybe make the argument that jungle mid wasn't all that bad in this series, and, Wei got a lot of resources. He certainly was the focal point for what RNG wanted to do, and Tong Yuan on the Taliyah really tried to enable that, but bot and top lost so hard that it was almost impossible, and it's not like Wei fought particularly well towards the back half of the game. Hang was definitely the more proactive jungler, and so there's a lot to like from, WE and not a lot from RNG in this one. LWX is gonna get yet another dud of the series. This guy is just, he's washed. There's nothing else to say. Maybe, like I've said with other players, maybe he goes to a different spot. Maybe you get him out of the league for a year. Maybe you can get his mental readjusted and he can come back in the league. But for the past year and a half, this guy has been mentally checked out and he has no confidence in the laning phase in particular. And it's just not a recipe for success. Ming has been horrible this split. Breathe really feels like he's given up. 2 games of Cassante that he didn't even try to win. Wayward just kind of dominated him in lane and was significantly more useful out of it. Breathe had a very bad week after having really the only good start to this split that RNG has had. It's just not good. There's nothing else to say. RNG is one of the worst teams in the league. There are a lot of those right now. I think everybody basically from 13 downwards are just not particularly good, whether it's RNG or Thunder Talk or Ultra Prime or Rare Atom or Edward Gaming. They're all bad teams, but RNG is very much in that cluster more so than any sort of cluster near the playoffs. And for WE, this is a good team. They are clearly a playoff team. The expectation is for them to be competitive, but they honestly remind me so much of OMG from last year. I think it's a pretty apt comparison. Them and Ninjas and Pyjamas are going to be fighting it out, for upper tier spots. I think they're very similar teams in terms of how they end up functioning. Maybe they're not quite as talented as a team like NIP, but they work together maybe a bit better, especially if Stay turns into a really good AD carry. This could be a very scary WE team that nobody's really talking about in that way. Then moving on to our second series of day number 6, and again, a team that should be a playoff team versus a team that shouldn't be a playoff team, but it was closer than it should have been. LNG Esports taking on Ultra Prime. LNG is going to pick up the 2-1 win, and you're really glad that they were able to do that, but man, there are genuine, real concerns with this LNG team. Dropping a game to Ultra Prime is not what you want to see when they're in the run, the stretch of their season where they're supposed to be picking up the easy wins that they weren't afforded towards the beginning of the split. Yes, their record is starting to recover, but as we've talked about multiple times on this channel, I want to reiterate, I know you guys watch all these videos. If you've gotten to this point, you're probably a fan. You've probably heard me say this, but expect LNG's record to get better, but this team is not better. They're just having an easier stretch now in terms of the way things are going. For Ultra Prime, this team continues to look competitive in losses, although not in the way that you would expect in this one. It was Hacker who continues to look very good for this team in their wins, and Doggo, who actually was very good on the Callista in game 2, but everything else was kind of a disaster. We'll get to it. But for LNG, player of the series to me obviously goes to Hong in the support position. He's got to be back in for the rest of the split at this point. Whether you want to say Mark is a bad player or not, and I certainly don't think that. I think on a more aggressive-minded team with a more aggressive-minded AD carry and, a team that wants to play around early game a bit more, I think Mark could actually be a really big positive, as we've seen for Top Esports over the last couple of years. But Hong fits the style of what LNG wants to play so much better, and I think putting him back in really does accentuate that. His his Nautilus in Game 3 was near perfect. I mean, even if you talk about, like, stylistic differences between Hong and Mark, like, Hong's mechanics are ridiculous. He's one of the best supports in the region, and it's really good to see him back in the LPL. The Nautilus was basically, like, aimbotted he was scripting in Game number 3, couldn't miss a hook, and it was a positive thing this time, as opposed to some of the other times we saw him in big moments. It was just really good stuff. The guy was phenomenal in this series in both Game 1 and specifically in Game 3, but I think a lot of people are going to look at Zika as well. He really liked the Cassante in Game 1. Cassante just dominates in matchups that he's really positive in, but he was going into Decade, and Cassante's really broken. And honestly, I really wasn't all that enthused about his Gwen towards the back half of the series, and so that's the reason he's not getting Player of the Series, even if he was a bit more of a carry. Gala was very good, but a lot of that was set up by Hong, specifically on the Senna in Game number 3. Still did a great job to capitalize on it, but it really was support creating. And Scout was good too. Weiwei didn't create a lot of negative plays like he has been over the course of this split by being off-tempo with the rest of his team. I think LNG just looks solid. You would have liked to see them win Game number 2 and not exactly drop a game to Ultra Prime, not give Doggo and Hacker the opportunity to outplay you on Maokai Callista, but it is what it is. At least you were able to walk out of the series with a win. But for Ultra Prime on the other side, again, a competitive team that isn't particularly good. That's kind of where they've slotted. That might even make them the 13th best team in the league. I mean, truly, LGD right now is at number 12 in my power rankings. Who's to say Ultra Prime is not better than RNG and Thunder Talk and these teams that just can't be competitive to save their lives? But outside of that, like, there are very, very clear problems with this team. Decade's going to get yet another dud of the series. This guy is just not playable in the top lane. We talk about Hoya being awful. Decade has been significantly worse, and he's just not, he can't survive. Like, you give him a neutral matchup, and he can't survive in lane. It's like me playing top lane. It's not what you want to see at an LPL level. I don't know, what you do with him. You got to send him back down to the LDL, hopefully get his confidence back, but whatever's going on right now in the LPL, it's just not working out. Jue was also pretty bad here. The Maokai support's just not working for Ultra Prime. They get destroyed by it in their games, and they don't really do anything with it when they pick it. Jue's just clearly not a very competent Maokai player, and it's okay, but it's not working. You can't really pair that up with something like a Smolder and expect to actually be relevant. Uakai was just nothing. You put him on Karma and Talia, the exact opposite of the playstyle that he has shown that he can succeed on and actually win you games on over the course of this split, and so he was basically not in this series. Scout was way more useful on the other side of this matchup, and like I said, Hacker was awesome on the Maokai in Game 2, and Doggo had some interesting qualities this series, especially on the Callista when they were able to win, but Hacker was also really bad on the Xinjiao in their losses, and there's really nothing Smolder or Senna can do when the rest of your team is losing, and so for Ultra Prime, again, they just fall into the same traps and the same problems that they've had all split long. Top lane is a disaster. It's a wasteland. Support has really started to trail off after what was a pretty good start to the split and a really promising LDL run from Jue. And it's not like Doggo's good enough to be able to carry that bot lane. Uakai is interesting, but you took him off of the playmakers and the assassins, and Hacker's been pretty good for this team, all things considered, but he's not going to win you games. He's not the kind of player who can do that. So Ultra Prime end up losing this series, but, staying competitive in it. That's just kind of going to be their fortune. Them and LGD, the teams that were supposed to be at the bottom, they're going to stay competitive and not win series. That's kind of just the thing that they're going to do. But for LNG, at least they were able to pick up the series win in this run of form where they're supposed to be picking up all of their wins. I don't feel very good about this team. They moved to number 9 in my power rankings last week. I don't expect them to move all that much going into next week. Hong is definitely an upgrade for this team, and he makes them better, and it's really nice to see him get comfortable. And if Gala can get a little bit more active and be kind of the primary focus for what LNG does, I think that raises the floor of what this team can do, but right now they've just shown nothing against top teams, and you lost a game to Ultra Prime. It's certainly not a series like this that completely erases all the negative thoughts I had last week. And then moving on to our third series of day number 6, and it's a battle of the bottom teams. In my opinion, the two worst teams in the LPL squaring off. Edward Gaming taking on Rare Atom, and Edward Gaming is going to pick up a pretty massive win for themselves in this one. It's crazy good to see this if you're an EDG fan. It just gives you some semblance of hope that some of these players aren't the worst in the entire world, but there still are real problems with this team. It's just nice to see them actually have a very clean 2-0 win over a Rare Atom team that has looked better and did put in the player I've been asking them to put in Xiaoxi in the support position. We'll talk about him. I was wrong, I guess, because golly, not a good series from him, but we'll talk about it when we get there. For EDG, player of the series is going to go to the Snake. This guy was miserable in his first couple of series, but credit to this org. They've given him some patience. They've given him some time out there, and this was the best series he's played in the LPL, both last year and this year. He finally was able to put together a series that felt like he was a competent AD carry, and he has been getting better game over game, and that's a really good thing to see. If it's all confidence, then maybe he can get to the point where he can be a mid-tier AD carry. Really has not been that over the course of this split. We can't discount the fact that he was miserable over the first couple series that he played, but, give him resources and give him the opportunity to actually play against a bad bot lane like Asum and Xiaoxi, and he can actually do something. He was relevant in this series, but I really want to give a big shout out to Vampire. I've been so critical of Vampire. I was critical of him in the preseason because this guy was hot-shotted into the LPL, and that almost never goes well. He was predictably horrible in his first couple of series and has continued to really not be good, has been one of the worst players in the LPL, but he finally had what I would consider to be an all-around good series. I think this is the best that he has played in the LPL. A lot of people are like, oh, we got to stick it out with Vampire now. This guy's obviously cracked. He's really starting to figure it out. Shout out EDG fans for being super optimistic, and shout out to all of the league fandom for, and it's almost become a catchphrase at this point, recency bias. Love that for them. In 3 games' time, when Vampire continues to be bad, they're going to call him the worst player of all time. It's just how things go on talking about LPL, on the LPL subreddit and everything like that. But Vampire was pretty good in this series, was certainly better than anything he has shown at all in his LPL tenure up until this point. Ale continues to look great in their wins. This guy's not practicing, it doesn't matter. Xiaoshu's a relatively competent top laner, even if he hasn't necessarily played like it this year, and Ale made him look absolutely disgusting in this series, especially in that game number 1 on the Cassante, where he just obliterated Xiaoshu in that game. Monkey is definitely the right choice to play in jungle. I don't know what's going on with Jeje, but his heart is not in it. I think Monkey's a really interesting jungle prospect. He's actually one of the players I'm most looking forward to seeing more of on this roster, and Fisher was fine. He got to play against Vikla, and Vikla was good in this series for what that's worth, but, you know, that's mostly because Fisher is not particularly good, and it's nice to see the Snake stepping up and Vampire stepping up because Fisher has not really taken that next step. But this is a good win for EDG, one that is, you know, really solid to see. It doesn't really change the outlook of this team, but it certainly makes you think a lot about Rare Adam and about how not good this team is in its current state. Xiaoxi, pretty easy choice for dud of the series. I've been clamoring for this team to put Xiaoxi in. Kazora is just not the answer. This guy has never really been the answer. He wasn't particularly good with RA. His first stint certainly wasn't good on anyone's legend in a bad bot lane last year, and, you know, he got another shot here. Him and Assume have not clicked. I wanted to see what Xiaoxi could do. This is a guy who went to Worlds last year, was actually super good at Worlds, in my opinion, one of the biggest standouts of the play-in stage in terms of individual performances, but, you know, he got his shot here, and he got absolutely blasted by Vampire, so, you know, maybe that wasn't the right call. You know, poor guy just never really had an opportunity. Clearly, he's not been scrimming with the team, I would imagine, because he did not look in sync with the rest of them, and it did not work out. He was far from the only player who played bad, but he played the worst, for sure. Xiaoshu also got obliterated. I think you could realistically give him dud of the series because he was awful in this one, but, you know, I think that's more Ale being very good and Xiaoshu being awful, even if he has taken some notable steps back in the same way that someone like Hang has taken some notable steps back in year number 2. Vikla was easily this team's best player in this series, trying his absolute best to do anything. This guy's going to get criticized in basically any situation. I think he's been better than he gets credit for, but only because he was so bad in the first couple of weeks, and I think people were predispositioned to kind of expect him to fail on this team. He's not been good. I don't want it to seem like he has been good at all, but he's not been the single worst player in the LPL, and I think a series like this kind of shows that. Assume has been really, really bad this split. That's a prediction that I think I ended up getting right. Not all of my predictions ended up going right, but I've never been a big fan of Assume, and it's, you know, it is interesting to see him just kind of fail, but, you know, his supports have been really bad, so how much of that do you attribute to that? Nayu is a take I got really wrong, right? I was super high on Nayu, and I thought he was going to come in and really dominate the LP. I thought he was going to be Milky Way. Like, what Milky Way is doing right now, I thought Nayu was going to do that. He just hasn't been doing that. RA is the worst team in the LPL. That was confirmed in this series, and unfortunately, that just ends up being the case for a team that, you know, at the beginning of the year in January looked very good. They went to the Final Four of Demacia Cup, but here they are now, the clear number 17 team in the LPL, and then for EDG, you're probably not the worst team because you just beat the worst team, but you're still pretty close. I wouldn't expect this to really ignite a playoff run from this team at all, but the Snake is getting better. Hopefully Vampire continues this upward trajectory. I like Monkey, and Ole's obviously very good, but, you know, there are real concerns, and I wouldn't expect this to really change the fortunes of EDG in 2024. And that's going to bring us to our 7th and final day of LPL action here in week number 5, and we got to kick off day 7 with a really, really interesting series. Weibo Gaming taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and FPX completes the 3-0 week, and boy howdy does this team look good right now. They are on a ridiculous winning streak, even going back into last week as well. They're looking very, very good, and obviously there's one player in particular that is breaking out as maybe the next potential superstar of the LPL. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but even when FPX has struggled this year, you know, we'll get to why maybe there's reason to believe that the team's success isn't exactly going to continue for the entire year, but even when this team has struggled, Milky Way has dominated this year. He has really emerged as one of the most interesting jungle prospects the LPL has had in a very long time. The jungle factory of FunPlus Phoenix continues here. with Milky Way coming in. Weibo drops another series, and they're actually going to drop below 500 in terms of their series score, still above 500 in game score, 11 and 10 coming out of this series. But Weibo is not this locked team in the top 6 that everybody thinks they are at the current moment. There is a lot genuinely going wrong with their roster and a couple of players that I just don't know if they're going to be good enough this split to make that world's impact that they were able to make last year. So before we talk about them, we have to talk about FPX. And of course, the conversation continues to start around Milky Way, who just has been sensational over the past, month or so. He was really good to start the split when he got put in at the back half. I believe week number 1. It could have been the start of week 2. I could be wrong on that, but I believe he was put in the back half of week number 1, and it has just been smooth sailing for him since there. Even when this team isn't playing particularly well, he has been a highlight in 2 games of Kindred in this series that he is just able to dominate on, really be incredibly impressive on. It's a very, very cool thing to see for FPX. He's clearly player of the series, by the way. I don't know if I said that. He has been phenomenal to be able to get like 4 marks in 10 minutes or whatever, something ridiculous that he got. Like, his pacing is crazy. It's really hard to deal with. And, even with the rest of this team maybe not stepping up in every single circumstance, it still was a really good series for Milky Way. And he could have 1v9'd if he needed to here. There were a couple of good moments from a lot of the other players here, but he could have 1v9'd if he was absolutely asked to. I think a lot of people are going to look at Dectum and say, all right, bud, like, you got to start doing something. And I agree that he was way too passive, didn't really do anything, had a couple of bad plays this series that got bailed out by Milky Way. But I think he's been better this split than people have been giving him credit for leading into this series. And so I'm willing to cut him a bit of slack and say that this is probably not going to be like a recurring problem for him, especially considering I think life was fine in this series. Rumble's starting to become kind of a signature pick of his over here in the LPL for FPX. Rumble's actually kind of worked for this team, and I think it's kind of interesting to see. Still not huge into Care in terms of his development over the course of his career. I was really high on him last year, but he hasn't taken that next step. I know a lot of that has been because he's playing facilitators for Milky Way to shine on this team, but I would love to see him get a little bit more involved in the early game and how this team wants to play out some of their mid-game skirmishes. It still does feel like Care is a bit more disconnected from the rest of this team than maybe other mid laners are. And Xiao Lao, who's not a star on the top side, ZDZ is just really bad in his current state, so Xiao Lao, who was able to have 2 good games of Kazante, but with Milky Way playing this well, with him being at such a high level, and with Life honestly playing so well, in my opinion, on this current stretch, I think FPX really is one of those teams that you have to look out for. I mean, even near like top 4, like, is that crazy? They've beaten a lot of the teams in like the 6 to 8 area, and so, I mean, is it really crazy to say that FPX could be top 4? I think it's crazy right now. I think that there is certainly a lot of development and consistency that this team needs to show. Again, there's a lot of recency bias when it comes to the LPL. A lot of people saying they had a phenomenal week 5. They beat 3 top 6-ish teams in the LPL. They're a top 5 team guaranteed. If they were a top 5 team guaranteed, they wouldn't have lost a bunch of the series that they lost earlier on this year. All 3 of their series losses would not have been losses if they were guaranteed a top 5 team. Maybe they turn that corner. Maybe Milky Way is going to play like this the rest of the year. Maybe Life's going to play like this the rest of the year. And if that's the case, then we will continue to move them up. But I do want to be a little bit cautious about just anointing them after one good week. We've seen this before in the LPL. But for Weibo Gaming on the other side, there are real problems with this team. Dud of the series is going to go to Xiaohu once again in the mid lane. I think game 1 was actually fine from him. Game 1 was actually pretty back and forth, and Xiaohu had a couple of good team fights, but he also had some bad positioning towards the back half, which is pretty rare for him. It's something that he does excel in terms of being, a team fighter as a player, but game number 2 was awful. He's really starting to make me concerned. He'll have these dips in quality every so often. He's had it throughout basically his whole career, but usually it's in the summer. That's where like Spring Xiaohu comes in, even though I think that moniker is way overrated and overvalued. But he has been really, really bad over the course of the beginning part of this split. Certainly not nearly as good as he was last year or the year before. Certainly something to keep an eye on. Poor Light probably should have won this series. Light played so good, so well on the Lucian in game number 2. And you would have hoped that a better performance from the rest of his team would have probably carried him to a win, but it just wasn't going to be enough. ZDZ was whatever on the top side. He played Smolder top lane and just couldn't do anything in game 2. And Casante still don't understand what the hell he was cooking up there. Xiao Hao really has been incredibly disappointing for this team. I had him pegged as a big breakout star in 2024 because, honestly, to me, he's been an all-pro caliber guy on anyone's legend for the past 2 years, but I think you can make an argument that he's always been a bit weaker in spring, and so I don't want to just call it just yet. And Crisp is very hit or miss. He's going to look bad when this team loses because he's the one that's going out there and making a lot of the plays, although I do think he could, he could wager to be a bit more consistent. That's definitely something I will say. But generally, Weibo is concerning, if only because their power points of the map aren't exactly power points. Light is this team's best player pretty clearly right now, or Light and Crisp are this, that's the power point of the map, and this team just doesn't want to play through bot lane. And I think that's really going to cost them. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Weibo. But for FPX, I mean, they have clearly found their secret sauce, their style to get them over the top. If Milky Way can continue to be an MVP caliber player, a clear Rookie of the Year frontrunner, I mean, this could be one of the more dangerous teams in the entirety of the LPL. And then moving on to our second series of day number 7, and it's another kind of upset. We've gotten a lot of these this week. It was Anyone's Legend taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas. And AL is going to pick up a strong 2-1 series win. And honestly, this is more of a 3-0 than a 2-1. They had game 1 in the bag. They really didn't lose that one, but they ended up throwing it, essentially just not protecting their base and not playing clean League of Legends down the stretch. Rookie was amazing in game number 1 on the LeBlanc, and you end up losing that one, but it's okay. Rookie's very good. The rest of the series was very controlled by AL. They were the better team, basically, across all 3 of these games, and that's very encouraging for Anyone's Legend. I think that's one of the best things you could have possibly said coming out of a series like this against a team in Ninjas in Pyjamas that, again, while people are down on them, have at the very least looked consistent over the beginning part of this split. So let's go ahead and talk about how they ended up getting their player of the series. Pretty obviously for me goes to Krako in the jungle. Pretty massive jungle gap in this series. I love Aki. I've been very high on him on this channel over the course of the last 2 years, specifically last year where I felt like he broke out. He was very clearly a top 3 or 4 jungler in the LPL in 2023. Whether or not that was going to be sustainable moving into a new year was definitely up for debate. There was definitely no guarantee that he was going to continue to be that great, but he's been okay. I would say at the start of this split, some good and some bad from him, but Krako was definitely better than him in this series, and it was really kind of the biggest gap that AL had in their favor in this one, in my opinion. Krako, like I said earlier this week, is going to be one of those players that's going to be more of that feast or famine. He's going to win you some games, he's going to lose you some games, but when he is on, when he is having those good games, he is very difficult to deal with, and that's what we saw in this series. Game 2, Game 3 were both very controlled by Krako. He did a great job of being able to get gold onto the right priority targets, namely Shanks and Hope, and really get them going and moving forward. I think without him playing as well as he did in this series, they don't win, and I know Shanks and Hope are going to get more of the spotlight for this series for how they played, but to me, they do not win this without Krako playing as well as he did. So credit to Shanks and Hope. Shanks has been a great carry, somebody you can put as a primary option on this team that can win you games very consistently. Krako, obviously a great person to be able to get rolling, but him and Shanks have actually played off of each other, consistently pretty well. I think they have very, complementary skill sets, and again, getting Krako back with Kale, I think has been a positive, but it was Hope in this series, in my opinion, that really stood out as the big carry for AL. This was a really good week for Hope. He's always kind of just been a good AD carry at this level. Even at his peak in JD Gaming, he was always just kind of a good AD carry surrounded by really good talent. These are the kinds of performances you want to see out of a player to really go like, oh, he can be a top, AD carry in the league. He can be a top 6 or 7 AD carry in the league, and I think Hope kind of proved that that's possible. Again, not the hardest bot lane to end up doing that into in this series, but he did go ahead and have a good series. So that Kale was very good, as he almost always has been across this split, and even Harry I thought was the better top laner in this series, which is certainly not something I expected going into this. So very good stuff from AL. You're just happy to see Krako step up, for Shanks to be such a good primary carry, and for Hope to honestly have such a great series. Those are the really big positives. And then for NIP, it is going to start to get at least a bit concerning, but in the same way that I said for FPX, that I'm not going to freak out and just immediately put them into the top 4 because they had such a good week. I'm not going to freak out and immediately move Ninjas in Pyjamas to number 9 because they had a bad week. This is not LNG. This is not the same kind of situation. This is 2 series that they weren't able to perform in, and both against teams that are kind of peaking in a very good way right now. Yes, do I want them to play better? Absolutely, but Rookie was phenomenal in this series, and he has been phenomenal all year. He's a better version of what a lot of these other teams are built on right now, and so I think the foundation for them is fine. I just think that the cracks are definitely starting to show. Shanji has been not so great in this split, I should say. He's going to get done of the series here. I don't think he's been nearly as bad as some people would say. Again, this goes back to just kind of the all or nothing mentality that a lot of League fans have. It's either this person has been great this split or this person has been garbage this split. It's very rarely a conversation of this person's kind of in a bad run right now, even though they started kind of hot. And that's more the case with Shanji. Basically, everything I've seen on social media is Shanji has been horrible for Ninjas in Pyjamas this split. This guy has sucked since coming over here. I don't think that's an accurate statement to make. He was very good in weeks 1 and 2, but I do think he's in a bad run of form ever since we hit ever since essentially we came back from Lunar New Year break. I think Shanji has been worse since then, and he's going to need to get a lot of his confidence back. If you're not better than Harry in a series like this, that's definitely a bit concerning. And Aki definitely got gapped in the jungle here. I think he could have absolutely been done of the series. It was the 2 OMG boys that really cost them here, even if I do think that they were very good at the beginning of the split. I expect at least Shanji to be able to turn it around. He's too individually talented for this to become a trend for him. But Aki is somebody who, maybe was a little bit more of an overachiever last year. He kind of broke out without a lot of the raw tools or the raw, prospect pedigree to kind of expect that. And so, to see him, maybe kind of return back to earth in 2024, I think is realistic. But Rookie was truly sensational in this series. He attempted to 1v9, just didn't have the talent to do so. Photic and Juo are also kind of crashing back down to earth more predictably, which I think is definitely a little disappointing. We were hoping that this was going to be kind of the breakout for Photic in 2024 and, that the consistency could really start to come along for the first time basically in his whole career. But it seems he's starting to return to some of those tendencies he had very negatively in 2023. Juo was also returning to some of the TES days, and it's just not a good look for NIP. Again, I'm not going to lambast them. I'm not going to say that they are unsalvageable from this position, but it certainly was not a good week, and they're going to need to change their fortunes if they do want to get back into that title race. And then for AL on the other side, this is a playoff team pretty clearly at this point. 7-3 is a very good record, even if their game score is significantly worse than that. Krako's a very hit or miss player, but when he does hit, this team is very scary because Shanks is a great carry, and Hope has really been playing better as of late. I think him and Kale have very good chemistry together. AL feels like it's finally found a collection of 5 players that can make it work, and I think that's really, really nice for this org. And then moving on to our final series of the week, our third series of day number 7. Again, thank you so much for sticking around with me through my hoarse voice, my gone voice through this video. I really do appreciate it. But our final series of the week is a good one between OMG and JD Gaming. And JDG is going to get the job done. They still struggle to close out games. Specifically, this game number 3 was a very sloppy end. It really took some major mistakes from OMG, some major gambits from OMG to end up ending this in favor of JDG. But this team is so consistently able to get their own early game leads that even though they're not the cleanest at being able to close anything out, they still are very good and adept at being able to win games because of just how good they are in the early and mid game, how good their mechanical advantage is. This OMG team is interesting. I still really don't know where to land on them. 500 really does feel accurate for them, but it's just very strange. They are good in certain areas and bad in other areas. They're good in certain games and bad in other games. It's very strange to try to get a read on this OMG team, but I think the best I can give you is that this team is fine. They are okay. They are good. They're interesting, but they're probably not going to be super. It's nice to see them get a win over JDG, though. So let's go ahead and talk about this series. Player of the series for me is going to go to Ruler in the bot lane. Ruler's awesome. I mean, what else do you want me to say? I'm like the biggest Ruler fan out there. I feel like I've made that abundantly clear that, I think he's the greatest AD carry of all time. I think that his performances at his peak are basically unrivaled. He's the best mid-game player in the history of League of Legends, regardless of role. There just really aren't players who have been able to take over in the way that Ruler has been able to take over for so long in such a pivotal position. And so to me, Ruler is somebody who obviously deserves all the fame and praise and recognition that he is going to get, and he was awesome in this series. He's been very good for this team at the beginning of the year. The crazy thing about Ruler is that you don't even have to give him resources. He can just take over the game isolated in a 2v2, and missing's a big part of that. He's very good in lane, but Ruler's been able to do that basically no matter who his support has been able to be over the course of these, last decade almost, and so, Ruler's awesome. He's great. He's going to get player of the series here. Kanavi has also had a really good week for JDG. Really needed that. Kanavi was kind of a star for this team last year. I think there were moments, and especially in the summer regular season, where, Kanavi was the best player on JD Gaming in 2023. Maybe not the entirety of the year, but certainly through a lot of that summer split, Kanavi was kind of the driving force for what JDG wanted to do, being the best team in the world for a lot of that. And it's good to see him kind of get back to that. That Lee Sin game in Game 3 was especially kind of endearing. Flandre played a lot better down the stretch in Game number 3, even though the beginning part of this series on the Aatrox wasn't particularly good. He's been a lot more volatile than I think you wanted to see from him. This team has been very used to having a very stable top side with 369. I think going from that to Flandre, who is going to be a bit more back and forth in terms of the performances that he's going to offer, is certainly an adjustment and perhaps is a little bit of a stylistic difference for JD Gaming. But I think having Yagao, who's a lot more stable than someone like Knight even in the mid lane, is actually probably a positive step in that direction. Whatever the case, JDG needs to figure out its late game macro, and from then on, I really don't think this team's going to have that many problems. Flandre's attackable in the early game because he plays so far forward in lane, but outside of that, again, there really aren't a lot of weaknesses. The individual talent of this team can go up against anybody else in the entire world, and we continue to see that game after game. And then for OMG, like I said, this is an interesting team, but like not a like super particularly interesting one, just kind of a little bit of an interesting one. They're exactly what I thought they were going to be at the beginning of the season, except that is probably like 2 or 3 playoff placements higher than I thought it was going to be at the beginning of the season. Dead of the series is going to go to Abel, even though his scoreline looks pretty good because almost all of that came on the Smolder in game number 1, where he was able to hit that late game, able to take over in some mid-game fights, get accelerated a bit, and really just dominate and get a lot of gold. In games 2 and 3, he was not good. The Ezreal, the Aphelios, they just were not working, specifically the Ezreal in game 2, which was the worst game anybody played in this series. Abel's one of those weird players that is going to be more hit or miss. I think I've notoriously been a little bit lower on Abel than maybe other people were. You know, I was a big fan of OMG last year, but a lot of that was Cream, Aki, and Shanji on the top side of the map, and obviously PP God. Abel was always the player that I really didn't know if he was going to be that breakout star. I always thought that he was going to be a little bit too inconsistent to ever be one of the best 80 carries in the LPL. He kind of got there a little bit last year. He certainly had good moments in the playoffs, but, you know, the inconsistencies are still there, and when you go up against the best bot lanes in the world, like Ruler and Missing are, Abel's really never been able to keep pace and to keep up with those kinds of bot lanes, and I think that's been a bit disappointing. PP God has also not really been all that great this split. He was okay earlier this week, but, you know, I think that these two have taken a step back from what they were in 2023, and that's definitely a sad thing to say. All that, you know, adding on to Xiaofeng and Angel are actually playing really well right now. This jungle mid is a huge strength for OMG. Xiaofeng actually had a pretty interesting series, especially in their game 1 win, and Angel was awesome in game 1 on the Ahri, just everywhere on the map. Angel has like quietly been one of the top 5 mid laners in the entirety of the LPL, and with how many mid laners I've been hyping up, that is a crazy statement to make, but he genuinely has been that good. Cube is still a question mark, and, you know, they wanted to try to play towards him, but he's really not talented enough at this point in his career to be able to be like a strong side top laner. They're just, you know, there are good things about this OMG team. They're going to beat teams that they can win through jungle mid and really dominate that side of the map, but if they need a complete performance out of all 5 players, they're going to struggle a bit more like they did in this series. Again, perhaps maybe they made game 3 interesting and, you know, JDG struggled to close it out, but OMG is exactly who I thought they would be and then some. This is an okay team that is going to be interesting, but is never really going to be dominant. And for JDG, you just hope they can figure out some of these late game macro issues that they've been having, because outside of that, this team feels basically untouchable with Ruler, Missing, Yagao, Kanavi, Flandre, all playing well in some way, shape, or form right now. 7-1 is very deserved, and, you know, the top 2 is not a surprise, but they very much are still in that. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Week 5 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated standings after 5 weeks of action here in the LPL. Of course, 1 to 10 on the left, 11 to 17 on the right to kind of show who's currently in the playoffs, who's currently not in the playoffs. In the first column to the right of each team, you're going to see a couple of things. First of all, power ranking. That's my personal power ranking of these teams from number 1 to number 17. And then second, you're going to see change, how that has changed from last week to this week, so we can go over the risers and the fallers in today's video. Of course, 1 and 2 staying the same, BLG, JDG, and number 3 also staying the same with Top Esports sticking at number 3, but number 4 is going to change. It's somehow, some way, WE moving into number 4. Somehow, some way of all the teams right now, WE has been one of the most consistent and one of the ones that I feel the best moving into that spot. Do I feel great about that? Absolutely not. I really feel like this is going to fall off at any moment, but Wayward has been phenomenal. Fofo's been pretty consistent, and the addition of Stay in the bot lane has honestly changed the outlook of this team for me for their upside because of how good he has been. They're going to move up to 4 if only because nobody else has proven that they can take that spot consistently yet. NIP is going to fall down to 5. They're going to swap places because of that, and our big riser this week, no shocker, it's going to be FPX moving up to number 6. Perhaps some people are going to move them higher. They are on this 6-series winning streak. They were 1-3 to start this year, even losing to teams like Ultra Prime, but now they're really starting to bounce back and look a lot better, and obviously they've absolutely destroyed this week. If they can keep this up, if this momentum that they've been generating is a snowball effect that's going to keep going, you know, I'm willing to make more changes in the future. I just want to be hesitant that it really was 1 week or 2 weeks that have really been kind of the standouts for this team. If we're sitting here at the end of week 6 and the end of week 7 and this team is still just rolling and they're sitting at 10-3 or 11-3, then yeah, they're going to get closer to that top 4 in terms of my power rankings. But for now, I want to be a little bit cautious and keep them at number 6. I am going to right a wrong from last week. I should have put Invictus Gaming above OMG. They are the better team, so IG is going to move to 7. OMG is going to move down to 8, even though neither really surprised all that much this week. And then 9, 10, and 11 are very difficult to decide. I moved AL up to 9. Anyone's Legend feels pretty locked in for the playoffs right now as one of the top 10 teams, and I feel good about moving them up to 9. But that means the final spot is between Weibo Gaming and LNG. And that's really not a spot I thought either of these teams were going to be in. Weibo's going to stay at 10. LNG is going to be at 11 or move to 10. LNG is going to move to 11 because I think that I trust Weibo a bit more and I thought they were better going into this week. But either of those two teams could be good enough to take that final spot. LNG is going to have a much easier road right now, and so they could very much have an easier path to take that 10th and final playoff spot. But the bottom of the standings is basically, or the bottom of the power rankings are basically going to stay the same. LGD at 12, RNG at 13, Thundertalk at 14, Ultra Prime at 15. Nothing really changing there in my eyes, but EDG is going to pass RA. RA is going to move down to that dreaded number 17 spot because EDG beat them this week, and it's pretty clear to me, but those are the two worst teams in the league. I think that is also very clear to me, but let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with the changes that I made? Do you want to see me make more? Honestly, I would be shocked if this is not drastically changed next week. This does not feel like the power level that I think these teams are at, but I just don't know any other way to order them. If you have a specific way you have them ordered that you think is, you know, more accurate than mine, let me know down in the comments, because this is probably the least confident I've felt in my power rankings in the LPL in a long time. The cluster right now is very, very clear, and I don't know who's going to come out on top in it, but it's time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week in week number 5 here. Player of the week, I mean, come on. Is this even really a question? Is this up for debate even remotely? It's Milky Way. This dude dominated every single game that he played this week. 6 wins, 1 loss. All 6 of those wins were Milky Way dominated. I mean, truly, what else do you want me to say? This guy is emerging as one of the best junglers in the LPL. If he keeps this up, he could win the MVP of the entire split, let alone be a potential breakout star for next year. And so, really happy to see what Milky Way and FPX are doing right now. Runners up for me, Kanavi. Kanavi would have won it most weeks. He had a phenomenal 3-0 week for JD Gaming, but, you know, Milky Way was just a little bit better. Kanavi was truly sensational, and they really are starting to play through him again, though, which is really big. And then Shanks, the mid laner for AL, both of them were also runners-up last week, so very funny to see them continue on. And Milky Way was also a runner-up from last week, so very, very intriguing to kind of see that and just see the success patterns that we're seeing from some of these players. But dud of the week, unfortunately, for week 5, had a lot of options for this one, but I landed on LWX, the 80 carry for RNG. He's just completely not in it right now. There's really no other way to say it. Even I, who was a hater, couldn't have predicted that he was going to be this poor in 2024. It has been a disaster for RNG, not only in terms of the bot lane, but in terms of the whole team. And LWX is a pretty big part of that. His letdown has certainly been pretty clear to see. There were definitely other options. He was certainly not the only one that I was considering, but unfortunately, my dud of the week in week 5 is going to go to LWX, and my player of the week in week 5 is going to go to Milky Way. But that's going to do it. Let me know down in the comments if you agree or disagree. Let me know if you enjoyed or didn't enjoy the video down in the comments. Again, I really want to thank you guys for sitting through this. I know my voice isn't exactly great, and I can't guarantee that it will be better by tomorrow because I just recorded like 2 hours worth of LPL video, and so I can't guarantee that the LCK video tomorrow is going to be a ton better, but I do appreciate you guys sticking around for it. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LPL on this channel. We post about all 4 of the major regions. That's LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week, as well as the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.